Hello, friends, and welcome back to the Jank Tank. This is episode number 22. My name is Timothy Zaccanino. I'll be hosting for you today. Joining me on the line, I've got what sounds like a very well-rested Teld and what may or may not be a slightly hungover Christopher. I don't want to put that on you, but just judging on how I'm hearing voices today, that's what it sounds like I've got with me on the line today. How are we doing, gentlemen?
Hey folks, I'm awake for you guys right now.
I am also conscious. We are here today.
Man, isn't it great that we're just bringing our best selves to maybe the most important episode of the year so far?
Bringing that excitement level, I hear it.
Yeah, the professionalism you've become accustomed to.
I'll fake some like really high level of excitement for all three of us here. But I mean, we're talking about Modern Horizons 3, so like Chris said, yeah, this is probably a game changer for a lot of people, including us. I mean, Modern Horizons has a pedigree at this point of breaking magic, and it looks like Modern Horizons 3 might be doing that, though it might be doing it at the common level instead of the rare level this time. Our topic today is going to be a Modern Horizons 3 review for Cube. We're going to keep it pretty high level, though I think Teld and I are looking at doing a peasant review as well for this one. There's just too much good stuff to pass on not talking about it. So that'll be a bonus episode if we actually sit down and do it. I think we've already got the notes all typed out for it, so it's going to happen. It might just take me a little while to edit it. But yeah, we're going to keep this high level, talking about all the things that we could pass for our environment, but also things that the Cube community at large might get excited about. And we're going to try to keep a brisk pace. We all shook hands virtually at the beginning of this recording. We said, you know what? We've got so much to talk about here. We're not going to spend 10 minutes on every little removal spell. We're going to keep a brisk pace. We're going to keep it going, and we're not going to get caught up on any particular Simic 3-4 flyers or anything like that. Yeah. So that's the agreement we all landed on.
It's probably to the episode's benefit that Teld and I are operating with diminished capacity this morning. The diminished capacity Teld and Chris might actually be the better version of Teld and Chris. We're going to find out.
Normally, I'd spend a little while talking about set mechanics and the logistics of the format, which I'm still going to talk about very briefly, but because of the nature of Modern Horizons 3, we don't have to spend a lot of time talking about all 40 or 60 mechanics that they're bringing back. We will kind of cover those when they're relevant for the cards we're talking about. Modern Horizons likes to use a lot of one-off mechanics and a lot of spins on old mechanics and even combine them in interesting ways. If you've never experienced one of these sets before, the whole purpose is to print cards directly into Modern without having to go through Standard, though they're Commander precons for some reason.
I think you mean radically redefine Modern, I think is what you're looking for. Like, just completely redefine their own format and eliminate its purpose and meaning. But, sorry.
They're the power creep sets. They're the ones we associate with power creep.
Hey, remember when Modern was defined by a range of sets? What if we told you that the entire constructed format was going to be these 3 sets that we specifically made for the format, and then the rest of the history of Magic provided like 6 support cards? Would you guys be interested in that format?
I mean, Lord of the Rings is in there too, right? That's basically, people were calling that Modern Horizons 3 for a while.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the printing of these Modern Horizons sets is like, well, it's funny though, because you could say it's like good for Cube, but on the one hand, it's like absolutely maddening because when they print these, you're just like, oh, look, there's another ridiculous banger that is probably good enough, even though it's a common. And then you end up having to talk about a million cards.
Yeah, I hope people are ready for the 70 card Peasant Cube update.
It's actually probably going to be 70 cards. I did want to mention, too, we're in the Play Booster era. The whole, design behind Play Boosters is like no bad commons or anything like that. So if the last 2 sets, MKM and Thunder Junction, are any indication of like what Play Boosters are going to be for the future, then, having a Play Booster set that's also a Modern Horizon set is a little bit scary. It's a little bit scary because they're just pushing everything at all rarities now. So we get the usual brokenness, but now all the commons are broken too.
Yeah, you sneeze and there's a common combo sometime.
Not going into the set mechanics super hard here, but I did want to mention some of the buckets that everything kind of falls into and how relevant they are for us. Like I said, there's a bunch of return in mechanics, but the 3 kind of main overarching mechanics for this set are energy, which is only going to apply to us on a card-by-card basis. It's not a synergy thing for us. It's usually pretty parasitic, but we've seen in the past that energy cards that create their own energy and use their own energy can still be fine. Think like your glint sleeve siphoners and stuff like that. Eldrazi and Devoid and Colorless in general is a big thing, and that won't apply to our review as much. So like the Eldrazi Titans, we're not going to talk about those, but I'm sure like Vintage Cube will get good use out of at least one or two of them. And I did want to mention up front that there's a lot of Eldrazi spawn tokens, which may or may not apply to our review, and I have a habit of calling those the Eldrazi Scions, but they're all the 0/1 versions that sack for mana. The last big bucket is modified. The Abzan spectrum covers a lot of modified archetypes, and some of those will be relevant for us. But again, those buckets are kind of what the set is designed around. There's a couple one-off things like affinity for artifacts in red-black and this draw 3 theme in blue-black. And then I also wanted to mention up front the modal double face cards. We'll actually be talking about quite a few of these. These are making a return from, Zendikar Rising, where they were kind of like a pretty revolutionary mechanic, I would say. And they really pushed the power level of them here. But just to cover up front, there's 20 MDFCs in this set. 10 of them are 2-color tap lands on the back, which we'll talk about 1 or 2 of those. And then the other 10, there's 2 cycles of monocolored MDFCs. But these are like the bolt lands from Zendikar Rising, the mythic rares, where you can pay 3 life to have the land come in untapped. And that applies to all of them. So we don't mention that, and I just mentioned that an MDFC is a tap land. Just remember that you can pay the 3 life to have it kind of come in untapped for the colorless stuff. Another big thing here is the free spells, which we're not going to cover basically at all. This applies to the Evoke Elementals, and I think they're called the Flares. These new broken free spells that they feel like they have to put in every Modern Horizon sets. We're just not going to talk about them because we do not care about free spells for our environment. But yeah, obviously some of the free spells will be good in your kind of Vintage Cube, your Eternal formats and stuff like that. 2 terms that may or may not come up. I don't think they will here, but just in case. Kindred is officially being used as a replacement for Tribal, and this is the first set where it appears on actual cards. Umbra Armor is the new replacement for Totem Armor. There was like a sensitivity thing where they decided to make that change. So there are a couple Umbra Armor cards. That's not a new mechanic, it's an errata. Teld, you mentioned a couple of the new to modern reprints that we're going to see that we're not going to talk about here. Did you want to just go down that list real quick?
Yeah, so the ones that I saw that seemed relevant, obviously the pitch elementals that you just mentioned. In addition, there's Kappa Cannoneer, a very powerful artifact synergy card. Recruiter of the Guard, which is like a really good value piece. There's Prismatic Ending as a removal spell. Sylvan Safekeeper, which is protection for various decks. Priest of Titania, Wirewood Symbiote, if you run elves kind of stuff. There's Deep Analysis, a classic card draw spell. Buried Alive, great for graveyard synergy decks. There's Cephalid Coliseum and Barbarian Ring, both threshold lands that have reasonably powerful effects. And the most important reprint of all, Junk Diver, the artifact card our community is based off of.
The OG itself, yeah. I also had a note here that we don't talk about Commander exclusive cards on this podcast because we don't get those cards on Arena. Even though a lot of times some of the biggest heavy hitters from new sets are the Commander exclusive cards from the Commander decks. And I don't know why in holy hell there's even Commander decks for a Modern Horizons product in the first place, but the face Commanders actually are coming to Arena. I just don't believe any of them are going to make the cut. There's actually one that we can talk about off air that I thought was interesting that I overlooked, but we'll get to that another time. But that's the lowdown with Modern Horizons. We are going to be talking about quite a few powerful cards and then some niche stuff as well. But if you don't see something mentioned here, that's probably because there's just too much powerful stuff to talk about literally everything. So we kind of handpicked what we were excited about. So with all of that being said, any upfront stuff you guys want to cover about the set before we get into the card by card?
Yeah, I mean, this set looks pretty cool. I was watching some Aspiring Spike this weekend, and he had a comment on the set that I think I also agree with, that a lot of these cards look like they're really, really powerful, but also they aren't Ragavan, right? They don't just say, play this card, do good things. They kind of ask you for some sort of deck building or like some sort of gameplay build around. Which I think is really good for design. I think it's a lot better when these cards are powerful, but ask you to do something with either your deck or like when you're playing them, ask you to do something. And some of them are just going to be really, really powerful in a limited environment, but it didn't look like we had quite as many Hogaks and Ragavans floating around this time, or pitch elementals, which I think can only be good for modern if you were a modern player, I imagine, instead of like radically redefining every deck in the format with just raw power creep.
It seems like they were trying to seed or bolster very specific archetypes in Modern, and I can't speak to Modern very well, but there are some like one-off energy cards that could see play outside of an energy deck, but they went really hard on like these buckets that I was talking about, Modified, Eldrazi, and Energy, and those kind of define a lot of the set while still having a couple generically good cards in, some good removal that we're going to talk about as well. But with that being said, who wants to go and kick us off with some white 1-drops? We've actually got, I think, 2 that we want to talk about this time around that we're going to be trying out in our own personal cube.
Yeah, I guess I'll start us off. So first up of the 2 white 1-drops we want to talk about is Guide of Souls. So this is a 1/2 human cleric. And it says, when another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life and an energy. And then whenever you attack, not when this creature attacks, but when you attack, you may pay 3 energy. When you do, put 2 +1/+1 counters and a flying counter on target attacking creature. It becomes an angel in addition to its other types. So this card seems great. It has the problem that a lot of 1-drops are going to have of not being necessarily the best top deck in most situations, especially if you don't have other sources of energy. But on turn 1, this is going to be a threat that has to be answered without, like, you don't have to answer it immediately, but before they get to that 3 energy in attack, so by turn 3 or so, you're going to need to have found a removal spell for this most likely, or you're going to have a big problem on your hands. But basically, it lets you convert every 3 energy into turn your creature into an angel, which is going to be very, very powerful for aggressive decks. On top of that, the life gain will come in handy. Like we've seen it, Peasant, the Lunarch Veteran, can be a pretty reasonable card just off of its life gain in various synergies. Stuff like Soul Warden, I think is the name of the card, has been a very powerful
Soul
card.
Sisters,
the Soul Sister stuff. So these that line of text is not necessarily throwaway. And in fact, with the next 1-drop we look at, it actually is kind of a cute synergy. So that's not throwaway text. And I think this card looks great.
First of all, they've printed a variety of cards in the last few years that say, like, Thing becomes an angel in addition to its other types. And every time I read that, I hear, look, Mr. Bubbles, it's an angel. And I just, like, for you Bioshock fans out there. Yeah, it's interesting. So it's got a Thraben Inspector body. And then, obviously, mechanically, what this is doing is very different than investigating. And Teld, if you want to expound on this, please. But we've been having a lot of conversations recently, and it took me longer to adopt this position once Teld took it than, like, maybe it should have. But we're just increasingly, I think, reaching a point in Magic where Savannah Lions without, like, significant utility is really starting to suffer because they're just printing creatures at 2 and 3, at 3 especially, but now they're printing, like, 2-mana 2/3s. I mean, I'm sure you guys have had this experience. I've had the experience where I'm the aggro player and I'm on the draw and I play my Savannah Lions on turn 1 and then something comes in on turn 2 and my Savannah Lions doesn't even get to attack, so I basically, like, spent a mana to mulligan.
Yeah.
Which sucks, right? And so the metrics around which we've historically judged Savannah Lions have changed because they're getting invalidated on board faster, and the stat lines on 1-drops haven't evolved in tandem with the evolving stat lines on 2s and 3s. So these days, from my perspective, it really feels like 1-drops need one of 3 qualities. The first is, if it's going to be a Savannah Lions, it's got to offer some, like, really, really fantastic utility. Like, Dauntless Bodyguard, I think, is my favorite Savannah Lions. Cheeky House Mouse helps push some damage through boards, etc. Or it needs to be like a Thraben Inspector, where it's not the most aggressive play on turn 1, but it is a body, and then it provides the ability to draw into cards later. In this case, it fits that third criterion where it snowballs well. Like, if I play this on 1 and then I just curve out into creatures, as Teld mentioned earlier, like, you kind of have to kill this before I can dump the value on something, or you can wait till I dump the value and kill it. But, I mean, at the end of the day, like, you were going to have to Doomblade that creature or a creature to not die anyway. And yeah, it's not a good top deck, but neither is Savannah Lions.
I just thought about this, but it sort of got like fair Giver of Runes vibes, where like Giver, when you play Giver, you have to kill the Giver before you can kill any of your opponent's other creatures. And this sort of feels in that same boat of like, when you play this, your opponent doesn't have to kill this, but you're kind of incentivized to, because this is just going to stay on board. And every time you're playing cards, you're going to keep getting energy and turning your dudes into real threats. And notably, unlike a lot of the text we see on cards like this in standard sets, this does not say non-token. So like a Tristani 5, for example, will automatically give you one of the triggers on this. A Resolute Reinforcements or a Blade Splicer gives you 2/3 of the energy you need for this. So it does scale out pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, you can just go 1/2 Blade Splicer, attack with your 2-drop, and boom. The other thing that has become increasingly apparent to me on white drops is this is a 1/2. Instead, I think this would still be fine as a 1/1, but what I like about it being a 1/2 is, depending on your cube's design, there are actually a lot of ways to make small bodies larger in white, which is actually one of the major edges I think it has over red right now. White just has a variety of ways to make these small bodies bigger, and I personally think that your 1-drop becoming a 2/3 with a pump is better than it becoming a 3/2 with pump. So yeah, I think there's a lot to like about this card, honestly. It's really dynamic, it's really interesting, it scales into mid-game value. If you draw it late, not good, but you know, as I mentioned earlier, neither is Savannah Lines.
Yeah, very few 1-drops are great top decks late into the game.
No. How about that brisk pace, folks? Chris, why don't you go ahead and take the other 1-drop here, Ocelot Pride, right in time for Pride Month, as it were, because this is also a 1-mana non-Savannah line body that we're interested in.
Okay, so this is Ocelot Pride. It's a single white mana. White really eating good this set. It's a single white mana for a cat, and it has First Strike and Lifelink. Pretty good combination of keywords for single mana. At the beginning of your end step, if you gain life this turn, create a 1/1 white cat creature token. Then, if you have the city's blessing for each token you control that enters the battlefield this turn, create a token that's a copy of it. So, just on its face, if this comes down as a 1-drop on the play, it's almost certainly getting in, unless your opponent responds with Thraben Inspector. Thraben Inspector, best card in the cube. A lot of 1-drops just don't even offer to trade for this. And if you get in once and then you make a 1/1, a 1-mana 1/1 First Strike Lifelink that made an extra body is already like pretty crazy good value.
1 mana raise the alarm, essentially.
Yeah, exactly. But I mean, like, one of the bodies has crazy keywords on it. Life from any source triggers this as well. So even if you don't have a life gain theme in your cube, there are a lot of different white cards that kind of incidentally do this here and there. So lifelink creatures, things of that nature. And then it has these like fantastic token synergies on top of everything else. Like if you draw this later, but you already have some token stuff going on board, you can theoretically duplicate like a Blade Splicer token or like a large Planeswalker token or something. So this card is just really, really good. And as we mentioned earlier, like white pumps creatures really well. And if you can put like a single +1/+1 counter on this, you're cooking with gas.
Luminarch Aspirant, baby.
Oh yeah, this into Luminarch Aspirant is probably going to end a lot of games, and we're probably going to hear some grumbling about it. Honestly,
one of the best Bone Splitter follow-ups to like play this into Bone Splitter, make your 3/1 First Strike Lifelink that makes bodies. Yeah.
You can't see my face right now, but I'm grimacing really hard.
This card either needs to go unimpeded on the first turn, like your opponent needs to play a tap land or not a Thraben Inspector, or you do need to find like some modification for it to probably push it through in combat. But if you do either of those things, like this is potentially just a 1-mana creature that's spitting out a 1/1 token every turn, minimum, and then possibly doing more once you've actually ascended, which it helps get you to that point where you've ascended
this is
as well.
Also the other Delny combo piece. So once you're doubling trigger this with like your Blade Splicer double triggers into double trigger this, which is going to be so completely gnarly. Disgusting. I think as far as our cube environment goes, the Blood Artists are probably your best bet as far as gaining life. They pair pretty well with this because it makes bodies, which then they die, which allow you to gain life, which allow you to make more bodies. So nice little synergy there. This will probably fit right into our black-white deck while also just being a good aggressive creature.
Yeah, Savannah Lions is dead. Long live Savannah Ocelots.
R.I.P. I mean, to quote Halle Berry from critically acclaimed movie Catwoman, meow.
Meow.
That's the end of the quote. Speaking of which, this one's kind of messed up. It's a Johnny Nakata Pariah, 1 in a white for a 1/2 legendary cat warrior at Mythic. When it enters the battlefield, create a 2/1 white cat warrior creature token. I could totally stop there. 2 mana 1/2 that comes with a 2/1 token is like already busted. Like this is what we're talking about when we say Modern Horizons pushes the envelopes. I don't think we've ever seen that distribution of stats across 2 bodies for 2 mana. Maybe we have and I'm just not remembering it, but that's just 3 worth of stats across 2 bodies, which is incredible. But there's more text here. Whenever one or more other cats you control dies, which basically means that token, you may exile a Johnny and then return it to the battlefield transformed as a Johnny Nikadal Avenger, which is a 3 loyalty planeswalker. You can +2 to put a +1/+1 counter on each cat you control. You can 0 to make a 2/1 white cat warrior creature token. When you do, if you control another red permanent, a Johnny deals damage equal to the number of creatures you control to any target. Wow. And then there's a -4 that makes your opponent sack down to like one of each permanent, non-land permanent type. So the +2 you're not going to do right away because your cat died to get this flipped. But you can 0 to spit out a 2/1 and just nug something for at least a point of damage, if not more if you have other creatures, which is insane. And it goes any target. So you play this overstatted 2-drop. You sacrifice the cat, or you just throw it in combat and trade it off for something. You get a Johnny flipped, and then every turn you get to spit out a 2/1 and nug a creature for damage. Seems insane without the Planeswalker, and then having the Planeswalker added to this is just
Well, it's
absurd.
also any target, so there quickly becomes a point where you're zeroing to dome your opponent in the face for like 6 damage. Yeah, this card seems completely and utterly bonkers. Like, I think most of the cards in this set are like cool and have some interesting play to them, but this is just the stat hammer, right? It's incredibly overstated, and it flips into even more overstated on a 2 mana planeswalker. I mean, like, how much would you pay for that, the planeswalker side alone? Because like 2 mana feels like a steal on that.
Yeah, I mean, it makes a 2/1, right? So and deals a point of damage to something. So I would at least pay 2 mana for a 2/1 that came in and pinged something.
Yeah, it's unreasonable.
Who wants to take Doggo here?
I like dogs.
Hit me with the Shepherd.
This card is Felia Exuberant Shepherd. We brought it in to chase off this fucking Ajani, so we don't have to talk about playing it. This is a 1 and a white for a 2/2 legendary creature dog flash with maybe some of the most like uninhibitedly joyous art I've ever seen on a Magic card. Like, this art makes me want to be a better person. It's a 2/2 flash for 2. Whenever it attacks, exile up to 1 other target non-land permanent. Jesus, it's not even creature. At the beginning of the next end step, return that card to the battlefield under its owner's control. If it entered under your command, put a +1/+1 counter on Felia. So, to be honest with you, I'm not even really sure why they put Flash on this, because I think it would be really solid without it, but the Flash is just extra great. You can target anyone's permanents, so you can disrupt your opponent's board to get good attacks in. Obviously, you can flicker your own stuff. If you do flicker your own stuff, this gets bigger. So if you manage to trigger this once, not only are you getting good value off of that, but in addition to that, this is growing, which, you know, provides the opportunity to threaten to do it again. Obviously, like, if you need to flicker one of your own things on the first attack to get value, this gets larger, and then the next attack, you just need to, like, flicker one of your opponent's blockers in order to get in with the powerful stuff that you just did. Really, really crazy. The flash on it means you can, like, you don't even have to represent that this is a possibility on board to your opponent for them to plan around. So if they go, like, if you're playing against, like, an aggressive opponent and they go, like, 1-drop and then they go 2-drop with haste, like, you didn't have to commit to the board, right? So they just swing in with their hasty 2-drop, you just flash this in. Now the board is clear for you to, like, play your Blade Splicer, attack, flicker it, and grow this, and then, like, you're off to the races. It just has so many edges. Like, this is obviously going to be good in decks that want to, like, flicker creatures. And even if you're not running a quote-unquote blink theme, there are just so many white creatures with good ETBs, Elite Spellbinder, Blade Splicer. But in addition to all this, I think you just play this, like, in most of your white aggro decks, right? For its ability to disrupt boards. This card's just wild. I expect this card to enable a bunch of, like, really cool synergies, but also just be like a crazy disruptive card. I think this might be a watch lister for me, just like right off the bat. I think this card's very good.
Yeah, this card seems completely wild, especially again on turn 2, this sort of snowbally thing where once you get one trigger on this of your own creatures and you make this a 3/3, your opponent's probably having to trade a real card for it. There's going to be a lot of situations where they can just set up blocks potentially that are pretty good, and you might have to just flicker their creatures to keep getting through with it. But like a 3/3, that's a real stat line. I do like this as a 2-drop that dies to shock, though, because that is going to be some of the meaningful counterplay to this card, is that some of the 1 mana tempo removal can get this card.
That might be a real big problem in Constructed, but at least for Cube, I feel like getting your 2-drop tempoed with a 1-mana removal spell isn't great, but it's not the end of the world.
No, but it is an edge that a lot of cards these days that are 2/3s, for example, don't frequently have.
True.
Next up, we have White Orchid Phantom. So it's white for a 2/2 with flying and first strike. And when it enters the battlefield, you choose up to one target non-basic land. You destroy it, and its controller may search for a basic land, put it onto the battlefield tap, and then shuffle. So this is Field of Ruin, stapled to a 2/2 flying first striker. I really like this sort of land destruction tagged onto like a creature that's actually a pretty good aggressive card, and then gaining it behind an early white mana cost will make it kind of difficult to splash while also punishing decks that are aggressively splashing. Even though we've cut the Triomes, we have mentioned before that in our current environment, it's fairly easy to splash, and it's nice to have a fair, like not Stone Rain card that will enable people playing white aggro decks to fight back against that those sort of multicolor piles.
It's good to have some amount of land destruction, especially because the creature lands, I always like that they're out to the creature lands because those can run away with games sometimes. But you don't want to introduce a bunch of Stone Rains in a cube of our power level. Maybe you can in Vintage Cube or something like that. But this feels like land destruction done white on top of a body that you could just play for the body if you don't care about the ability.
Well, I did see, there was a commenter that I had an interaction with on Reddit who was like, and I'm paraphrasing, I'm not trying to put words in their mouth, but basically they were like, well, your monocolored aggro decks punish your multicolor decks inherently, so like you don't need a mono white piece that does that, because your monocolored aggro deck should be keeping your multicolor piles in check. And my response was essentially that really depends on the design of your cube, and it really depends a lot on how good your mana is. You know, if your mana is really, really insane, it can actually be a disadvantage to be playing a monocolored deck because you're foregoing a bunch of power that you could theoretically stuff into your deck by just drafting great lands and going at least 2 color, like in an aggressive deck, right?
Yeah, it also feels weird to say something like that when part of the way that, in particular, white aggressive decks are punishing your multicolored decks is through effects like this that are disruptive pieces. Like that's what mono white does.
That's what it does. Right. Well, so I think it's an example of we are fortunate that we get to play our cube so much. And sometimes I'll see people on Reddit or just in the broader cube community in general say things as just like a generalized heuristic that's just kind of assumed to be true in sort of the theoretical world of cube. And it's like, well, you know, in theory, yeah, I get it. In theory, like your monocolored aggro decks should be able to punish your multicolored greed decks, but assuming that they just automatically do that in any given cube context is assuming a lot about what's going on in the environment. Anyway.
Did we mention this has evasion?
Yeah, this is a 2/2 flying first strike for 2, which it's crazy that that's not like a body that like makes me jump out of my seat anymore. It's still very good. What I do like about this is, like Tim mentioned, it gets the utility lands. I like that, at least in our environment where multicolor has been problematic, we've been looking at the mana, etc., that this is not a reason to be mono white, but it's a very nice little reward for being mono white. And if you're playing all the triomes and just like a bunch of great fixing, like we cut the triomes to try to reduce the quality of the fixing to some degree, but if this comes down and like pops a triome, because you guys have seen this, I mean, this is part of the reason that we nerfed the triomes. Like, how many times in our environment with, like, especially after the fetches got introduced, would you have an opponent have like all 5 colors of mana on like turn 2? Mm-hmm. Like, not uncommon. And this just being like, no, you don't get to do that. I think sometimes against those decks is just going to win the game.
A lot of times those decks are playing 0 to 1 basics. Like it's very, very limited on. And that's an extreme example. But if you're playing like the Omnath deck, sometimes they greed a little too hard, and this is the kind of card that they're not going to have a basic on their deck, and it's going to be literal 2-mana Stone Rain, and they're just going to scoop them up.
That's gonna feel so good. I have no sympathy for you.
Zero sympathy.
Yeah, but and you know, again, I feel like I should just like have a button or like some kind of drop to just push this instead of saying it. But white pumps bodies, first strike, flyer, 2/2, great body to put +1/+1 counters on, or Anthem.
Yeah, Bone Splitter eating good this set.
Really is.
Oh yeah.
So Tim, Witch Enchanter? Disenchanter.
Disenchanter, yeah. Witch Enchanter is 3 and a white for a 2/2 uncommon human warlock. When it enters the battlefield, destroy target artifact or enchantment and opponent control. So 4 mana Reclamation Sage. Not very good, but it is an MDFC. And since this is a monocolored MDFC, it's one of the ones where you can pay 3 life to have the land come in untapped on the other side, which honestly you're probably not going to do that often, but we like this one. I know I and Teld like this one specifically because this is an MDFC that allows you to put an effect in your deck that you normally wouldn't use a cube slot on. Like we don't use cube slots on cards like Lauren of the Third Path and Reclamation Sage because they're pretty much just sideboard material. But when you get to sneak that in your deck at such minimal cost, it really raises the stock. I'm a big fan of the MDFCs that let you do stuff like that rather than the MDFCs that are just cards you would already play but are also lands, which we'll talk about a couple of those. Not that those ones are like bad or anything. I just prefer when the MDFC gives me access to an effect I otherwise wouldn't really put in my deck. So think like Spike Field Hazard. I would never put like 1 mana red, deal 1 damage to something in my deck, but when you get to like sneak it into your deck, it feels a lot better. So we are going to be playing Witch Enchanter. I think this is just a rock solid card for a lot of different cubes, as we'll see with a lot of the MDFCs as well. So it's just a narrow MDFC. I think that's all we have to say about this one. Static Prison. This is an interesting one that we should talk about a little bit and see where we land on it. This is a single white mana for an uncommon enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, exile any non-land permanent an opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield, and you get 2 energy. At the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you sacrifice the prison unless you pay an energy. So you play it that turn, you get rid of something. Next turn, Static Prison sticks around. Next turn, Static Prison sticks around. 3 turns from the turn you played the Static Prison, you have to sacrifice it if you can't generate additional energy. Is that good enough is the question. It's obviously a very, very strong tempo play if you're able to just attack and get your opponent dead. You obviously can't play it in control and let the game go long. Where did we land on this one? I'm not quite sure how to grasp this card yet.
I think, like, based on the reaction I saw in our community, I think people are overrating this one a little bit, but I do think this is the kind of card that if you're trying to kill your opponent and, like, we're really just trying to get you dead as quickly as possible, so these white aggressive decks that are, looking to make a big double spell, triple spell turn, I think this is obviously going to enable that, and the clock won't matter as much. There's a part of me that also wonders if there's a world where Control plays this and uses it just to buy time in the early game to set up their mana and card advantage, and then like the thing sacks and then you wrath them, and it's just kind of like it bought you, 10 life or something for 1 mana and then set them up to get blown out on a wrath. I think that's unlikely, but I do have to acknowledge the possibility of it. But I think I would start with the assumption that, like, I'm looking to kill you as quickly as possible if I'm putting this card in my deck.
Yeah, that's what I'm into about it. So we've had some issues in the recent past where we made a bunch of design decisions around trying to suppress aggro, because it was so dominant in the cube for such a long time, and then as the meta evolved, some of those features just kind of remained, and we were still playing stuff like Portable Hole and Elspeth Smite, and these cards that, at least in our environment, like Portable Hole is obviously like Nutso in a bunch of different cube environments, but at least for like one is really heavily creature-based as ours, not too many, non-land permanents under 2 that are like hugely problematic that we still play. They were essentially kind of like control support cards against aggro specifically, and Teld sold me on this because I looked at this and I was like, okay, this is an opportunity to play a very cheap removal spell that is sort of inherently a tempo play and is going to be, I think, actively pretty good for attacking decks and middling for control. I've seen people play Soul Partition. I think it's 1 and a white for an instant. You exile target non-land permanent and they can recast it, but it costs 2 more. Some people really like that card. Some people think it's deeply overrated. At least for our environment, I think I like this better just because it's so cheap, right? So if you're curving out, you can go like 1 drop, 2 drop, 3 drop, and then like on turn 4, you can go like another 3 drop, and then here's Static Prison on the best thing you've played so far, and now I'm going to try to kill you from here. We'll have to see how it plays. I think that this is a really interesting effect. Obviously, if you can somehow generate additional energy, this kind of becomes like 1 mana, remove a thing. But in a vacuum, I like the design of this removal spell. I think it's solid.
It's a cool 1 mana removal spell. Very high upside, but very big downside too. Like, if you don't get to kill your opponent and they somehow stabilize or they tit for tat with you over the next couple turns and they just get their card back and you're down a card, like you're in bad shape. So you do need to be a deck that can like reliably just try to kill your opponent by leveraging this as a cheap temporary removal spell. So cool design for sure.
I'm not used to seeing Magic cards in 2024 with downside.
Who added Wrath of the Skies as a card to talk about here?
I tossed it in. It's not for us, I don't think. So Wrath of the Skies is X white for sorcery. You get X energy counters, and then you may pay any amount of energy, destroy each artifact, creature, and enchantment with mana value less than or equal to the amount of energy paid this way. So obviously an energy synergy card, but I just wanted to toss this out here. Depending on what's going on in your environment, if you have a lot of fast mana, things of that nature, the fact that this catches creatures, artifacts, and enchantments seems pretty good. So if this is like a way to annihilate like a quick like Browntown start or something on your end, that seems strong in like vintage year artifact centric cubes, etc. So this is just, I just wanted to call this out. I think that this is going to be good in someone's cube somewhere. It's just not for us.
This seems like a banger sweeper for the 100 Ornithopters cube. 2 mana kill all your Ornithopters,
and you get to keep the energy. Yeah. Cool reprint here, Savine's Reclamation. This was a commander card from like 2016 or something like that, but I believe it's been in Vintage Cube off and on. It's 2 and a white for a rare sorcery. Return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If the spell was cast from a graveyard, you can copy it and choose a new target for the copy, and obviously has flashback for 4 and a white. So 3 mana for like a one-time Sun Titan effect, and then from your graveyard, 5 mana for a 2 Sun Titan effects. Just a cool little value card. I mean, it's not much to say about it. It's a grindy card. It can give white access to some mana ramp with some fetch lands in your graveyard. It's really cool that if you find an alternative way to cast it from your graveyard without paying flashback with like Snapcaster Mage, that you get the full effect of the card, even if you didn't pay the full flashback cost. So I think this is a cool, like, not necessary card for any given environment, but it does cool things. And if you want a white grindy deck, if you want to give a white deck the tools to play into the late game, this is a cool card for it. I suppose you could just play it in aggro too. It's not like ideal there, but 3 mana to get back a 3-drop is a fine deal. We do get that effect for a lot cheaper now with like Help in Hand and the Unearth variants and stuff like that, but those don't have flashback. So I like the design of this card. It's a sweet one that I've seen do pretty good work in Vintage Cube. Cool to have like these commander cards repurposed for our cube now as well.
This feels like one of those cards that's probably going to be at its best in like the black-white sacrifice deck or in your Delny combo-y like value decks. Because like bringing back, I mean, I know we keep bringing up Blade Splicer. There's a reason. It just happens to synergize with everything. But, bring back Delny and Blade Splicer, and, you just kind of go to Value Town, bring back Delny and any other number of cheap value creatures that trigger with Delny. It's going to be really good. Bringing, Blood Artists die a lot, so being able to bring those back and alongside a friend is really nice, especially with the 3 mana sack outlets we're going to have access to.
Yeah, this seems like a cool card. Considering the dynamics of our environment and the cost, I'm not sure that I actually like this more than Helping Hand. This feels like the type of card that gets like way better if that permanent card text has a lot more meaningful upside than just creature.
Yeah.
I'm not sure about this one for us. I think we're going to try it, but my suspicion is that for the decks that Teld you just outlined, that Helping Hand is just going to be so much more efficient that it's better. But this seems like something we should try.
Discard this with NT on turn 2, and then throw it in your graveyard. You never even have to cast the front side. I actually think that's the downside of this card, right? I think the flashback, like paying 5 mana to get 3 or less cards seems like a really good deal, but the 3 mana for 1 card is not a particularly good deal. So if you can find a way to dump this into your graveyard, whether by milling it or discarding it with all the looters, for example, in blue, I think there's something going on there. But I do agree with you that in our creature-focused environment, it's entirely possible that you're not going to be maximizing this effect.
We'll see. Yeah, it's been a known factor for a little while. It's just new to us, so, we don't have to spend too much time on it. People know what Savine's Reclamation does at this point. That does move us into blue with RIP Tameo. I do like that they brought back these Planeswalkers, the Transforming Planeswalkers. Like, we haven't seen that really since Magic Origins, and they used Modern Horizons.
They did Dak dirty, though.
I don't understand. They should have done Dak Faden instead of Ralzeric here, but I get it, Ralzeric. People have, gush over Ralzeric, so fine. But this would have been the perfect place to do Dak Faden since they did him really bad in War of the Spark. But we are kicking off blue with the Tameo. I think we're all excited but unsure about this card, unless anybody thinks this is just like slam dunk amazing. But
It says investigate on it, so Teld's losing.
yeah, it's basically
but it doesn't ETB.
it's basically hard evidence with flying, right? Blue mana for a 0/3 flyer. When it attacks, investigate. So you have to attack with your 0/3 to make a clue token. When you draw your third card each turn or in a turn, exile Tameo, then return it to the battlefield. It's weird that the Ajani is a May and this one is not a May, but this Tameo must transform when you draw your third card in a turn. It becomes Tameo Seasoned Scholar, which notably is a blue-green permanent. It has a +2 until your next turn. Whenever a creature attacks you or a planeswalker you control, it gets -1/-0 until end of turn. -3, return target instant or sorcery from your graveyard to your hand. If it was a green card, add 1 mana of any color. Notably, this Tameo starts on 2 loyalty, so you can only use the +2 right away. And then Tameo has a -7. Draw cards equal to half the number of cards in your library, round it up, and you get a Reliquary Tower emblem. You don't have to discard to hand size. So the Planeswalker card, like by itself, is not super exciting, but that +2 ability does nerf combat a decent amount. And then once you've +2'd it once, you can -3 potentially the next turn to get back an instant or sorcery. And if you get the mana off of it, so be it. But I think what we're mostly interested in here is just a 1 mana play that pumps out a clue token every turn. I'm not 100% sure how good that is, but it seems pretty strong. If you want to transform this card, it's not that hard. Like a single brainstorm will transform it, or it's not too hard to like save up some clues and crack them in the same turn to flip Tameo. But like it looks like Teld noted here, do you even want to flip this half the time, or do you want to just keep drawing a card every turn? At some point you probably don't want to be attacking with your 0/3. You'll need to block with it. But yeah, talk to me about this card. I'm not sure where I land on it. It seems like it could be busted. It seems like it could be like just fine too.
I do think it's really funny that it's a 0/3 that wants to attack, and like this just occurred to me, but it would be really funny to go like this on turn 1, and then like next turn you smork for 0 and like chart a course, and you technically attacked, and then you flip this. Pretty funny. Teld and I have talked about this a little bit here and there recently. I'm not as high on investigating as Teld is, but I acknowledge that investigating is good. I think what we both agree on is after you have investigated some number of times, more investigating doesn't necessarily continue to add value. Because over the course of the game, you don't have infinite mana to crack clues. So I actually do think that I'm probably interested in flipping this potentially. I mean, I'm not going to like build my deck around flipping it, but I think after I've made like 2 or 3 clues, I think at that point I want the Planeswalker on board instead of the creature.
Yeah, I mean, I think this gets really interesting if you have the brainstorm, because the way this card is worded and the way all of these planeswalkers are worded, if your opponent tries to remove it, which they kind of want to probably if you're just drawing, like, if you're playing a longer, more protracted game and like you're going to have time to just draw all the cards that this card generates, like, can your opponent let you sit there and make 4 clues, right? If you're going to have the mana and the time to draw all of them. So if you've got the brainstorm, it does get in this interesting spot where like you can brainstorm in response to a removal spell. And I actually think that this sort of line, like while it sounds like one of those niche lines we're trying to avoid talking about, will actually be like one of the reasons to flip this card, right? Is to protect it from your opponent killing it, as opposed to just like wanting to flip this. I guess you could. It's hard to say because you always have to plus it the first time. And then we can minus it for value, which is a good deal. But like at that point, we're generating 1 card every other turn, I guess we can do that. We can plus again and then minus again, and then it dies. And like, that's a good bit of value. I'm not really sure where this card lands. It's hard to grok one because like it's never winning the game on its own, but it also is a very, very cheap way to generate a potentially very large amount of card advantage and seems quite good in control mirrors.
Yeah, this card seems cool. I'm interested to see what it does. This also feels like the type of card that could like say all of this text and then we play it and it just doesn't really feel like it's worth a card out of your hand, but I don't anticipate that being the case. I think that this is going to be interesting.
I'm going to laugh when the optimal way to play this card is to play this on turn 1 and then play like a Luminarch Aspirant or Bilbo Cactus on turn 2. You know,
no, I mean, dude, yeah, it is. Of course, dude, this is going in the doing bad stuff to yourself band deck.
Thanks for the on-air censorship.
The one time in Chris's life he has censored himself.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to throw the next one to you here because even though I think I mentioned it, I think you're actually like maybe the highest on it now.
Yeah, okay, so this is Mont Beeble's girlfriend. I mean, Emrakul's messenger. Sorry, there's tentacles in New York, guys. I had
Yeah,
to.
got him.
It's it's 1 and a blue for an Eldrazi Fairy Rogue. It's a lot of types. It's got 2/1 stat line and it's a flyer. Notably, it does not have flash, which is a keyword that we're generally looking for in our blue 2 drops. If they don't do something really great, but I actually think that this thing kind of does. So, whenever you draw your second card each turn, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless mana. Drawing your second card in a turn, not difficult in a lot of blue decks. For the cantrips that actually draw a card, as opposed to like selection, but like actually draw a card, if you main phase them to dig a little bit, assuming that you've got like your colors set up right, it's not like a like for like, but I can consider on my turn just to see like if I draw anything sorcerer speed that I want to do or whatever, and then effectively make that mana neutral. So then when I pass the turn, I still have the same amount of mana left over for counterspells, flash threats, whatever else. The tokens themselves, like even if you're not sacrificing them for mana against aggressive decks, one of the problems that these kind of like small blue creature decks kind of run into is dying to something counterattacking on the ground. These can chump those. And actually, the Scions can do double duty, which is nice. Like in combat, you can block a mid-sized incoming creature without trample, and then if you have something to do mid-combat, like Doomblade or draw cards or whatever, you can sack the blocker that's already gained you life by declaring the block, and then use the mana effectively to do something else. So I think that there's going to be a lot of edges on this, especially since a lot of our cheaper blue creatures loot in some capacity. It's possible that the lack of flash is going to be the death knell for this thing, but the other thing is, like, the giant blue spells are really brutal. Like, even if you just trigger this, like, once, and your Mystic Confluence, happens on turn 4 instead of turn 5, or your Sublime Epiphany happens on turn 5, or whatever, like, those kind of really back-breaking, multi-effect giant blue spells can really flip a table over completely, and having them happen a turn earlier is really strong, and depending on the context of the board, when you play this, like, you might be able to ramp twice. And at that point, I think you're really just cooking.
Blue seems to be the color that benefits the most from ramp, but doesn't actually have access to it because the blue finishers are just such back-breaking cards. In our environment, it's things like Torrential Gearhulk, Sublime Epiphany, the Shipbreaker Kraken, or whatever it's called if you're playing something like that. Just these game-ending cards, and just having them down a turn earlier can close out a game, like, instantaneously. So, the mana ramp in blue is very relevant, and we don't really get mana ramp in blue unless you're willing to move into green. So that's really good. And then just having chump blockers if you need to, like being able to, we've mentioned before in the past, like it's really hard to justify spending 4 mana on like a draw 2. In order to play big mass draw spells, we need them to kind of affect the board nowadays. And this kind of gives you a way to cast your big draw spells while affecting the board, even if it's just a 0/1 and you're chump blocking with it. Like, that's something that's going to buy you a little bit of time and justify spending your turn on just drawing cards, So I like this little thing. Being a 2/1 is kind of the saving grace here. 2/1 flyer. If this had a different stat line or didn't have flying, it wouldn't be really that exciting. But I do think this card's quite cool. This is going to go so hard with Ledger Shredder.
I think you do want to be kind of in the more aggressive spectrum of our cube, so in the teamer side of things as opposed to the Esper side of things, if you're wanting to use this. But I could see again an early Sublime just being so backbreaking that a control deck is interested in this. But I would imagine just like, if I'm just going in level 0, I'm gonna assume I want to be using the 2/1 body to attack with, and then like we're generating some extra value off the ones.
You want to talk to the FBI agent, Chris?
I do. Fuck you. Give me a job. I'm not joking anymore. Fuck you. Give us jobs. We have it recorded that you stole our idea, and you'll be receiving something on my lawyer's letterhead very shortly. Wow. This picture just says 4-spike bird. I think it's called Hope Ender Coatl. Yeah, it's Hope Ender Coatl. Okay, so this is 2 and a blue for a creature Eldrazi Snake. It's a 2/2. It has Devoid. I'm assuming that has some kind of constructed implication. And Flash. And when you cast the spell, counter target spell and opponent controls unless they pay 1 flying. So a while back when we did the episode about the woes of blue in the arena card pool, I think I literally said that I would accept a card like this. I said 2-1, but I would accept a 1-1 flash flyer that when it ETB'd, it force spiked. This is better than that in almost every conceivable way. First of all, it's 2-2, which is a significantly more relevant body. But as an additional edge, this force spikes on cast. So let's say that your opponent is another blue player, and they're playing out like a Svalin, and they're holding up Counterspell to cover against your Counterspell. And you flash this in. They can just pay the additional 1, but you're still going to resolve the 2-2. And if they decided that they wanted to counter this to prevent this from coming down, then the Svalin itself would still be countered because it's still being force spiked. You can't prevent the force spike from happening by countering the card. And I think that is an interesting little edge. Now, like, you could, because of that, you can't, like, ephemerate this and force spike something at instant speed, but I just think that that's such a narrow edge compared to the upside of actually force spiking on cast instead of ETB. Like, I just think that that's a really nice little additional, like, line of text on this. I'm not saying that I think that this is an immediate watch list card, but it's something to keep an eye on because, like, when this is cancel, make a 2-2 flyer, that's crazy, right? When that happens, that's just crazy, crazy good. And in the development stages of the game, people are tapping out with a fair degree of frequency. I think that when this gets full value, it's going to feel really backbreaking.
I guess you're offset a little bit because blue decks typically pass with a bunch of mana up, but I mean, if your opponent knows this is in your deck, they should be playing around it. I actually don't really think the cast trigger, I think I disagree pretty hard. I think the cast trigger was strictly made to downgrade this card because I can't think of very many scenarios in which we need to resolve through a counterspell unless it's in a format with like Force of Will or
yeah, I guess free spells are the only place where that matters. I think you're probably right about that.
Yeah, I think this card is good. I think this card is potentially very good, especially if you're able to leverage some tempo. So if you've played out like a Sleep Curse Fairy or, you know, one of the various 2-drops that apply pressure, and then now your opponent's like kind of incentivized to be playing heavily to the board, like trying to race you or something. I think this card gets better. It's better against green decks because they're the decks that are very quickly playing like 5-drops. And obviously they're going to get out of range of this pretty quickly. But, you know, if your green player plays a 5-drop on turn 3, like this snags that, and then you're like able to potentially race them. I think this sort of effect though does want to be like in a more aggressive color. You don't want to be playing this in your control deck if you don't have to, I don't think, because your opponent is just gonna potentially just like try to play around this if they know you have it. So I think this card's really good. I'm glad we got it. It's a card that I've wanted on the client for forever. I expect it to be like at least at peasant level a forever card and maybe a forever card at the higher level, though I could see Force Spike not holding up that well. But Modern Magic is about curving out, right? So like that effect, I feel like that effect's actually gotten better over time and not worse.
Yeah, I think what this card really signifies to me is that we understand what the current design of Magic needs more than Wizards does, and we should start our own company and make a better card game.
Yeah, better for sure.
Better.
A couple things on this one. First off, I think it's literally it's a cast trigger. I think for two reasons. First off, it's an Eldrazi, and Eldrazi usually work with cast triggers instead of ETBs as part of their flavor. But also, if it was an ETB, like just having this sit on board with like your potential ephemerates and whatever is just the most obnoxious shit in the world. So like, I wouldn't want this to be the ETB. Second, you mentioned constructed applications, and this card works with like Eye of Ugin and Eldrazi Temple, like the double tappers that make this cost like essentially a blue mana, which is kind of insane. So if you're playing like Eldrazi Typal or whatever in your cube, like I'm sure this card gets insanely pushed there as well. But yeah, this is just a very powerful card. Last thing I wanted to say was I don't think this card is too good, but player feedback is definitely going to make it sound like it's too good because people will complain when they get got by this card. It's going to feel like the worst thing that could ever happen to you, you know? Mm-hmm. So that's a big one, just a huge pickup there. I'll touch on this MDFC real quick because I don't think anybody's like super stoked about it. But Sink into Stupor is a instant in blue at uncommon. It's 1 blue. Return target spell or non-land permanent an opponent controls to its owner's hand. So basically unsubstantiate. As an MDFC, it's a monocolored one, so you can pay 3 mana to have the land come in untapped on the backside if you need to, and it's just fine. Like, again, this isn't doing something that blue cards in our section can't already do. It is nice that it can, like, bounce a spell off the stack, so functionally a counter spell, but it can get around, like, uncounterable spells and stuff like that. But I think we're all in the boat that this one is just perfectly fine. It upgrades your mana base a little bit, but it doesn't really broaden the scope of like what your deck can do or anything like that. MDFCs are just usually fine, even if they're not the most exciting thing in the world. So I think that's really all that needs to be said about that one. But that does lead us into what we all think is maybe a more interest in MDFC. Unless, Chris, you had something to say about the sink into stupid.
No. I just wanted to say, like, the more I've thought about this card, like, at first I was like, oh, this is a cool effect to just have, like, but the more I think about it, the more I think that this is just kind of, like, fine.
It's just okay.
It's just Otawara.
Yeah, but Otawara always comes in untapped without costing you life, and it's not even 2 and a blue, it's 1 blue, which is cancel mana, which, as we all know, is in blue decks can be tough because blue decks tend to be blue mana hungry in general. The more I think about this, the more replaceable it feels like it is to me. But
yeah,
anyway,
I think we're all probably there. Waterlogged Teachings, you had this pegged as one of the hybrid colored MDFCs that you wanted to talk about, which notably those on the back, they do not give you the option to come in untapped. They tap for blue or black or one of 2 colors, but they always come in tapped. So what's going on with Waterlogged Teachings?
So, I mean, this is just the front half of Mystical Teachings stapled to a dual land. So, Mystical Teachings it's been power crept out now, I guess, but it was historically a really popular, powerful card. So 4 mana altogether, 1 hybrid blue-black. Search your library for an instant or a card with flash, reveal it, put it in your hand, then shuffle. And we've just mentioned before the blue finishers, the blue powerful spells, a ton of them are instants or creatures with flash. And it is just a powerful, flexible card to be stable to a land. If you need land drops early, you can play it. If you're fetching up a finisher or like a counter spell, you can do that. I think there's going to be some player skill testing here because your opponent's going to know if you go get a finisher, like if you go get Sublime, your opponent knows they have it. And like a lot of times there's nothing you can do about it, right? If they've got Sublime, they just got Sublime. And now you know that you're cooked instead of just guessing that you're cooked. I could see this card being a little clunky in Modern Magic. It's kind of hard to think that that's going to be the case when it's stapled to a land, but I definitely could see that. On the other hand, I could see this being the card that, finally puts us to the breaking point on Sublime, because I know that card has a lot of negative feedback when it resolves. It usually just feels like it ends the game, and the more often you see that card, the more often it's going to feel that way. It becomes especially true if you're in a longer game and you've got like Sublime in your graveyard and you go get a Gear Hulk, because then you're just in straight up combo territory. But this card has a lot of little edges. There's tons and tons of flash cards and instant cards in our cube to go tutor. On top of just being a land makes it a really interesting card, just a pretty unique effect relative to a lot of the other MDFCs that I think are just generically fine effects. This was like one of the ones that's actually interesting.
Yeah, the fact that this can go get Sublime or Intrude on the Mind, or if you have it, Mystic Confluence or whatever, but it can also get Gear Hulk, or if you're playing it, Hullbreaker Horror. I just think this opens up a lot of like really interesting lines of play, because like sometimes literally the only card in your entire deck that you need to go get for the game to just be over is one of the cards that this can go get. So would we play Mystical Teachings in our cube? Probably not, but the fact that this is just on a tap land, yeah, I'm interested to see what this does. I think this is good.
MDFC, that's how you make a irrelevant card relevant again, is you just print it on the back of an MDFC.
You just staple it to a land.
Good. I'm glad you said Hullbreaker Horror too, because I think I said Shipbreaker Kraken earlier, and that's like a really
but I think everybody knew. I think I think everyone knew what you meant.
It's just in my head I was like, Shipbreaker Kraken's that dumb Theros card. But yeah, anyway, let's go ahead and move into black here. Black is probably the big breadwinner of the set, in my opinion, just in terms of reprints, let alone the new cards here. But I'll go ahead and kick off with Nethergoyf, notably not Necrogoyf, which apparently was a really bad Goyf card from Modern Horizons 2, but this is Nethergoyf, a single black mana for a mythic rare Lorgoyf. It has power equal to the number of card types among cards in your graveyard, and its toughness is equal to that amount +1. So it's got Tarmogoyf text for your graveyard only. It also has escape for 2 and a black. Exile any number of other cards from your graveyard with 4 or more card types among them. So I had pitched this card originally to try out in our cube, and I think it still gets there, but at the time I hadn't noticed that the escape clause requires you to have 4 different card types among the cards that you're exiling to bring this back, which is not only bad because you're not going to have 4 card types often enough to actually bring it back, but when you do, you're probably eating like your only artifact or your only enchantment in your graveyard, right? So it's just going to come back pretty small as well. But I do think if you ignore the escape clause, like a 1-mana creature that can become like a 3/4 as early as like turn 2 or 3 is, I think, justifiable, right? And as much as we rag on Tarmogoyf and don't like that card very much, black is a much better color for this. You have things like Thoughtseize and stuff like that, which just naturally go to the graveyard. So it should be easy to get this to at least a 2/3, if not bigger than that. And it's a 1-mana play. You invest 1 into it. So it's a little bit better than Tarmogoyf. Costs half as much mana, but worse in the sense that it doesn't count your opponent's graveyard. And I think there are some trade-offs there. I think this is just a rock-solid 1-drop that you can put in a deck, especially if you have ways of fueling your graveyard, though I will say the escape cost is kind of nothing text after having read it a little bit more. And Constructed, that's a whole different story, but for the purposes of like R-Cube, where the only artifact that's ever going to your graveyard is like the one of Mishra's Bauble or something like that, like I think the escape clause is going to be like a once every couple games type thing, not an every game type thing.
I think if you're flashing this back, it's probably because you need another body on board so that you can sacrifice it and deal 1 with Blood Artist.
Yeah, I think this is going to be just true for most cubes, that the escape's not really going to get there. Tarmogoyf obviously has the advantage of, you play it and then like you Thoughtseize and you Thoughtseize something that an opponent like has that's not a sorcery, and then it immediately gets bigger. This is going to be a wait and see card for me. I think like the escape is honestly for some theoretical constructed deck where you have like a variety of cards in your deck that have multiple types. So like an artifact, like 4 copies of like an artifact creature. Mm-hmm. I think if you're escaping this, you're probably in trouble. If that's like the best thing that you have to do with your mana, because like even if you have a huge number of different card types in your graveyard, which is far from a given in cube, like you're often going to escape this. And even if you had a bunch of different types in your graveyard, it comes back as like a 1/2. For 3. Not to mention the fact that black in a lot of cube designs has ways to leverage things that are in its graveyard already, so exiling them is not even necessarily something you want to be doing. But I think even if this is consistently like a 1-mana 2/3, I think that that's a worthwhile inclusion, and I think sometimes you're just going to draw it in a later game, and it's just going to come down as a 1-mana 3/4 or something, and that's solid. So
yeah, I think a ways back I would have probably been even lower on this card, but I actually think, what is the LCI goblin guy? Stalactite something?
Stalker.
Yeah. Anyways, that card's been pretty good, and it's relatively consistently like a 2/2 or a 3/3, and that requires a very specific set of circumstances. So I think I would expect that this card probably ends up being pretty good. If it's like a 1-mana 2/3, 1-mana 3/4, that's probably fine, right? And it threatens to be bigger than that, especially if you've got Bauble or Planeswalkers or whatever that can put cards in your graveyard for it. And like 1-drop big overstated thing is like it's fine, I don't expect the world from this, but if it squeezes in some damage, that's awesome, and sometimes this could just like snowball a game early for you.
It's also a decent target for like Unearth, right? Because you're throwing a sorcery in the graveyard to get this back, so it's probably coming back as like a minimum 2/3 with Unearth. You'd probably rather Unearth like a value creature or something like that if you had the opportunity, but it is a little edge for the card. So I don't think this is a forever card. In fact, I don't really see us playing this like down the line. We'll have to see how consistent its stat line is, but it really does only need to be like a 2/3 or 3/4 pretty regularly to be good, and you could just ignore all the escape stuff. Black 1-drops have also gotten like so incredibly good at this point that like this one I think is just worse than a lot of the other black 1-drops we're playing. So Emperor of Bones. I'll go ahead and talk about this one because I know there's some black cards coming up that Chris is going to be excited about, but maybe he's excited about this one too. Emperor of Bones is 1 in a black for a 2/2 rare skeleton noble. At the beginning of combat on your turn, exile up to 1 target card from a graveyard. It has adapt for 1 in a black, adapt 2, which means if it doesn't have any +1/+1 counters on it, the adapt cost will put 2 +1/+1 counters on it. It also has a triggered ability. Whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on Emperor of Bones, put a creature card exiled with it onto the battlefield under your control with a finality counter. It gains haste and sacrifice at the beginning of the next end step. And just a reminder, the finality counter means when it dies, it gets exiled instead next time. So you're talking 2-mana 2/2 that passively hates on the graveyard once per combat. And whenever you put counters on it from any source, whether that's its own adapt or something like a Luminarch Aspirant or a Brushwag or a Bristly Bill, you get to put one of the creatures exiled with it onto the battlefield for a turn and just swing with it for that turn. So this just seems like an excellent, just a really strong card, right? 2-mana 2/2 with passive graveyard hate and the ability to just free roll creatures from graveyards into play, and it becomes a 4/4. I don't have anything bad to say about this card other than maybe like it's another skeleton, so we might need to start looking at Cult Conscript here. But
yeah, card seems solid. Something about LTR land cyclers.
Yep, that's going to be good. And I think it's also worth noting, right, like, even if you don't get something really abusive off of the adapts, like, it's just a 4-mana 4/4, which is obviously, like, not something you want to be playing in, like, a high-powered cube at rare. But our play experience has shown us time and time again that being able to split the cost of a card up over multiple investments is actually a really huge deal. So, like, yeah, I mean, even if you are, like, on turn 2, like, you killed their Land of War Elves, turn 2, you play this, turn 3, you untap, you adapt this, you pump out their Land of War Elves, you use the mana to make a second play, like a second 2-mana play that turn, and then you just attack with this as a 4/4 on turn 3. That's a great line. Obviously, if you're able to discard something like an Inferno Titan or a Grave Titan that have ETB and attack triggers, that's bananas, even though you don't keep the body. Yeah, you can adapt it instant speed. So, like, as long as there's, like, something large exiled with this, if you're on the back foot, like, anytime your opponent's thinking about attacking into you and you have open mana, they have to be conscious of the fact that you can just 4-turn reanimate the largest thing in the yard and just, like, eat their best creature on attacks or whatever. This has a lot of cool edges.
You can reset finality counters as well, like by bouncing the creature or something. I don't know if there's, like, a black deck that's going to be able to do something like this, but if you can reanimate a creature with the ability and then somehow just, like, bounce it back to your hand, you just get to keep that creature. Finality counters don't, like, replace bounce into your hand. It's only when the creature would die next time. So you could...
I thought it was when it left the battlefield.
No, it's when the creature dies specifically. So if the finality counter is not on that, like, if you bounce it or you flicker it with a ephemerate or something like that, it just sticks around.
Yeah, so this is the start of Tim's Core Skyfisher arc.
I mean, it's really, obviously it's really good if you get to do stuff like that. So there's some busted lines with this card, but I think it'll play more fairly more often.
I don't want to give a hard number, but I'm guessing like 70% of the time this card is probably like fair and reasonable and interesting. And then somewhere in the realm of like 10 to 30% of the time, this card is going to be really, really stupid because you're going to play like, I don't know, you're going to play like Inti and you're going to discard a Grave Titan and then you're going to play this, or you reanimate your Grave Titan and the game is just going to be over on like turn 4.
Yeah.
Well, there's the annoying factor too of like your opponent could be on an Uro deck and you're just like, I'm going to passively eat your graveyard for the rest of this game and you're never going to get to do anything with your graveyard. So that's like a little bit of caution for me, is this like passive graveyard exile, but once per turn is not like the most insurmountable thing in the world.
You don't even have to necessarily reanimate something big, right? Like if you put this in a Blood Artist type deck, like there's going to be some turn where you're just like, okay, all I need on my board to do like a sack combo and win, or like swing in such a way that even if you do all the right blocks, the drains will kill you. You just get like your Blood Artist back and then get in and win.
Bony Boy should be fun. Brings us into this messed up little uncommon. Chris, take it away. This is your boy here.
This is Marionette Apprentice. If you've been following spoilers at all, I'm sure you've heard a lot about this. It's 1 and a black for a 1/2 human artificer, but Fabricate 1. Fabricate is whatever the number is. When the creature ETBs, you can put that many +1/+1 counters on it, or make that many 1/1 colorless servos. And then whenever another creature or artifact you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life. So I'm going to go out on a limb here and say that I think that this might be better than Blood Artist. Blood Artist triggering off of your opponent's stuff is real, but the fact that if you have plenty of fodder on board already for your sacrificey type stuff, that this can just be a 2/3 that like doesn't die to shocks and things of that nature and blocks 2-power creatures in combat or attacks into 2-power creatures in combat and also provides the Blood Arts effect is nice. We've talked about this concept before on this show. Like, some of the best cards in Cube are cards that do the thing and enable the thing. So this is effectively a Zulaport Cutthroat with a second point of toughness that brings in a Duder. Not to mention the fact that, like, treasures technically go to your graveyard, right? Yeah, so, like, this has stupid edges in, like, a bunch of different situations, but even if you're just playing, like, a creature-based black sacrifice deck, like, a Blood Artist that brings a dork to feed to it is just good.
Yeah, it references in name and like the broad scope of the effect Marionette Master, but it doesn't have anything to do with like the power part of that card. So like, I kind of wish this had been like Fabricate 1 and then the damage or the life loss was equal to number of +1 counters on it, but maybe that would have been broken.
No, you don't.
But it also would have been
no, you don't wish that.
That would have.
I don't wish that. Like from a pure flavor perspective, I kind of wish that. From a gameplay perspective, you're completely right.
Man, these 2 bodies and 1 cards in this set are insane.
Yeah, this card seems cracked.
Yeah, I mean, this mechanic of bringing in its own little nerd is like the reason that you play Ghost Rider, right? If Ghost Rider didn't make its own fodder, it wouldn't be a particularly strong card, in my opinion. If Bastion of Remembrance didn't make a 1/1 nerd when it comes in to enable its own drain effect, that wouldn't be a playable card.
I mean, we were on Glazatep Reaver in the Peasant Cube still.
A relatively massive upgrade to Lazatep Reaver. You know, the one notable thing on this is it doesn't gain you life, so it's not going to swing a race in the same way that some of the other Blood Artists do, but that's
true.
That's
fine.
That is relatively
that's
minor
fair.
when you're getting this much value. Yeah.
Yeah. Speaking of fair cards, Teld, do you want to take the new sack outlet here?
Sure. So it is Warren Soul Trader, 2 and a black for a 3/3 zombie goblin wizard, and you can pay 1 life, sacrifice another creature, and create a treasure token. Notably, none of this is gated. There's no tap.
Once per turn, right?
There's no once per turn. None of that. It's just do this thing and make a treasure. This card is very dumb. It actually, we had to cut Forsaken Miner, which was like on the short list of cuts anyways. We had to cut it specifically because the combination of this card, Blood Artist, and Forsaken Miner created an infinite combo that would just kill your opponent. The black sack deck always flirts with being a soft combo deck when it's firing on all cylinders, but this card just, I don't know, making this much mana, giving you the ability to sack your board while also being able to re-trigger a bunch of your things along the way. Like, if you imagine a world where you have a reasonable board, which is not uncommon with these Blood Artist decks, and you just like play this and you're sacking your Cult Conscript, making mana that lets you pay half the cost of bringing it back so that you can bring it back and do more pings. I expect this card to be very, very silly, even in the fair cases, and downright broken in the more unfair cases.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really funny when this card shows us that we cut Yawgmoth for being problematic, and then we decided to play this. I think it's probably going to do some shit like that. This is also, as Teld mentioned, this has interactions with a bunch of other powerful stuff that Black can do just kind of incidentally, and like this might end up being a card where it's like, well, it's problematic with these 5 other cards. So clearly what we're going to do as designers, because this is the right thing to do, is to cut those 5 cards instead of cutting this card.
Obviously.
Because that's just what you do. Just stupid powerful. I think everybody knows that it is. I do like that at least they had you pay 1 life. Mm. So you can't just like go up a bunch of life, even with a Blood Artist effect on board. And if you have something like Marionette Master on board that doesn't drain, like being repeatedly doing this will damage you significantly. But I expect this to break something in Modern. I don't even know anything about Modern, but I expect this to break something in Modern.
It's a zombie and it goes infinite with Gravecrawl. They had to have done this on purpose.
Oh shit, yeah.
Yeah, you play Gravecrawl on turn 1, you play Blood Artist effect on turn 2, you play this on turn 3, you win the game. It doesn't work with Miner that way because you need to have a mana when the Blood Artist trigger goes on the stack, and so the triggers don't work out right. But with Gravecrawler, there's no such nonsense. You just win the game.
They had to have wanted the. It also has 3 relevant creature types for decks that care about that, like Zombie, Goblin, Wizard.
Yes, our Grixis Flame of Anor sack deck.
Yeah, this is one of the cards from the set where you look at it and you're like, they designed this card to show up in a viable Modern deck.
Mm-hmm.
For sure. Chris, talk to me about this removal spell here.
Okay, it's just a removal spell. It's called Consuming Corruption. It is black for an instant and uncommon. Consuming Corruption deals X damage to target creature or planeswalker, and you gain X life, where X is the number of swamps you control. It's like a Doomblade variant that rewards a strong commitment to black. On the one hand, it might seem like the life gain is not that relevant for a deck that's playing like black, because a lot of those tend to be more aggressively oriented decks. But there are a lot of black aggressive effects that give you something powerful in exchange for paying life, like Warren Soul Trader that we just talked about, or Tenacious Underdog, or whatever else. And even if you are the aggressor, spending a bunch of life over the course of a game does add up. Like, sometimes if you're playing a Yawgmoth deck, you just, like, look down at your life total, your opponent hasn't attacked you, and you're, like, 12. And this being able to catch you back up from that is pretty nice. You're obviously going to want to feel like you have space in your removal section for something that rewards a really heavy commitment to black. I don't know. I was higher on this before I started thinking about it more. I think there's going to be some situations, even in a black aggressive deck, where you really wish that this was just like Doomblade of some variety, because you're just, even if you're like mono black, you only have like 4 swamps in play or something. That's going to happen. But this is just an interesting little removal spell that rewards a heavy commitment to black. There's not really a whole lot else to say about it.
We're well past the point where Tendrils of Corruption was playable, but this is just that card at half the price and can target Planeswalkers, so...
Mm-hmm. I think we can breeze through this next one. We do have Dismember on the client now. It's a known factor. None of us are really fans of it because of the way it breaks the color pie. Just not a fan of Phyrexian mana in general for that reason. It's just not really cool that my blue deck can suddenly, murder a creature for 1 mana when you should have like some sort of reassurance that certain matchups can't do things like that. So I think we're taking a big pass on Dismember, on top of it being a mythic rare for the purposes of wild cards on Arena. But it is on the client now, and I'm sure it'll show up in a lot of different places. It's just not a card that we are personally interested in. Though we do have another black reprint here, which is a huge pickup, like way bigger than it seems if you're used to this card. We have Toxic Deluge on the client now as well, which is... not only a black sweeper that we would have asked for before, but I think personally just the best black sweeper that's ever been printed. I think better than Damnation by a good mile as well. It's 2 and a black for a rare sorcery. As an additional cost, you pay any amount of life, and creatures get -X equal to the amount of life you paid. So always costs 3 mana, takes a chunk out of your life total, but will kill what you need it to kill, assuming you're not at like 2 life or something like that. And the state of our black sweepers on Arena is just not good. Like, it's passable with cards like Languish, and we talked about Devious Cover-Up when it came out. Still not excited about that, but it was just like what we had access to, and this is actually like a top-tier good black sweeper for the Arena card pool.
Yeah, considering that for the longest time we were working with Crux of Fate. We brought it up before, like... Sweepers are, I think, becoming less important in the cube for a variety of reasons. This is another Teld. I should just learn that when Teld takes a position, that the third time I hear it, if I'm starting to agree with it even slightly more, I should just go all the way there from jump.
No. We don't do that here.
No. Look. I'm not saying the first time, okay? Sometimes Teld says literally insane things, and we have to protect, other people's brains from his mind virus. But he's actually been right a lot recently. Maybe I'm the problem. I don't know. Anyway... Yeah, no, this is a card that we've wanted for a really long time. White sweepers on Arena embarrass black sweepers in terms of quality. They just do. And that disconnect has always felt shitty in the list, because there's just like, okay, I'm playing a blue-white or I'm playing a blue-black control deck, and I know that if I'm playing blue-black, like, the sweepers that I'm getting are concessions to the fact that I need them, not good cards. This is a good card.
Yeah. I think in the context of like limited and cube and stuff, I do think Deluge is closer to like Damnation Extinction Event than it is in like Legacy, for example, or real or constructed formats where everything is going to be very, very small. Because sometimes you're going to have to pay like 4 or 5 life on this, and then like your aggro opponent, even though they just got Wrath, they're going to be pretty happy about it because they nugged you for 5. That being said, I mean, the efficiency of this card means also on the flip side of that, sometimes your opponent's going to go like, all right, 1 drop, 2 drop, get Wrath, or 3 drop, get Wrath, right? And then they're just going to lose the game. So yeah, it's a very extremely efficient card. Just and it's really interesting to have this card on the client because it means that the black sweepers we are playing are notably a good bit different than the white sweepers in terms of the way they play out, which I think is kind of a cool cube design thing to have available to us.
Agreed.
Happy to pick that one up. The next one's a pretty brief one, and as is tradition in Jank Diver design, the card we argue most about is like some inconsequential, like common or uncommon, but Fell the Profane, 2 black for an instant, at uncommon, destroy target creature or planeswalker, and it's one of the monocolored MDFCs. You can play it tapped as a black source, or you can pay 3 life to have it come in untapped. So it's just a kill spell that you can put in your mana base. While I'm on this being closer to like the stupor card, the unsubstantiate in blue, it seems like people are fairly high on just being able to slot in like a hero's downfall, a better Hagra's Mulligan, however you want to frame this. And like, if you want to make room in a cube for an MDFC that can straight up kill a creature, even though it's like an inefficient spell, you're more than welcome to do that. I personally think it's like not worth a cube slot, but if I were drafting a cube and it showed up, like, it would probably make my deck most of the time. So, like, there's just a little bit of a balance there. But yeah, kill spell that you can throw in your mana base seems perfectly fine.
One thing I do want to note on this is I actually think that this is like way better for aggressive decks than it is for controlling decks. Because if you're playing an aggressive deck, generally speaking, you don't care about the 3 life as much, right? And the other thing about playing an aggressive deck is the number of slots that you want to dedicate to removal. It's sort of premium because you need to jam your deck full of threats, right, in order to curve out and win. So you want your removal spells to be unconditional. You don't want to have to play room for a bunch of them because they're not your plan, right? Like, if you're in a spot where you end up having to remove like more than 3 creatures to win the game as an aggressive deck, you're in bad shape. So Tim's not particularly high on this one. I really love that in a black aggressive deck, I just get to run a land that costs me life that, and assuming I'm not in the aggro matchup, I don't really need, and just allows me to get like a 5th removal spell into my deck without having to sacrifice a threat slot. I think that's what this card is about.
Yeah, I mean, I think being able to slip like a 18th land in your mid-ranger control deck is kind of good, because like those decks are the decks that if you miss your 3rd land drop, you do usually just lose on the spot. Like the aggressive deck, sometimes you can stumble a turn or two and like still be able to apply enough efficient pressure, but like you do just lose most of the time in your controlling decks if you ever miss your 3rd land drop. So that's kind of nice. Yeah. But I agree. I'm not as high on this one as I was when it first got spoiled. I think it's cool that we've got access to it. I think it's awesome at Peasant specifically because Hagramulling being a rare meant that we were never able to play it. I think this sort of inefficient removal flexible slot is better at Peasant by just nature of removal being able to be a little more inefficient. I think it's fine. Like this card seems fine.
I'm higher on it than the other two, and like I said, specifically in aggressively oriented black decks, just being able to jam another Doomblade type effect into your deck without compromising your threat count at all, I think is like actively excellent for those decks. I think it's legitimately excellent. For a control deck, you know, the 3 life is not free if you're trying to control the board. The removal spell is really inefficient, but I was talking to Teld about this, and I kind of compared this card, and let me be clear, I don't think there's a direct comparison to be made here, but I was kind of comparing this card to like Bloodchief's Thirst, right? Which is single black mana to destroy target creature or planeswalker with mana value 2 or less, and then 4 mana to just remove the mana value condition. Bloodchief's Thirst is awesome because while neither one of those modes is like a card that you'd be excited to jam into your cube, it does either. And when you're playing an aggressive deck, sometimes you top Bloodchief's Thirst and you don't care that it costs 4. You just need to remove the thing that's preventing you from blocking and Smork. And this to me is similar because it's kind of the same sort of deal, like good early, good late, except the good early part is a land. I personally like this quite a bit more than Takenuma, which I know is a wildly different card, but I think that this actually does a job, and I think Takenuma is just kind of a free roll rando thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is no Malakir Rebirth, but you know, it's pretty good.
I think that's probably like enough said on it, right? Obviously, the undertones here is that I disagree with some of this, but maybe this is like a good single card discussion for a later episode or something, or maybe we should just talk about MDFCs and Cube in general for its own topic. But suffice to say that we all have varying opinions on it, and I think everybody's like either at fine or like a notch above or below fine, and we're all in like that same general area regardless of where we land on it.
I hope I've at least sold you a little higher on it as like a card for an aggro deck, because I think that's what it is.
Oh yeah, my position was never that this was bad. When we argued about it before, I was mostly pushing back on the concept of saying this is a free card, and like we all know there's like semantics at play there, so we'll leave that one there and then move on to what we all probably agree is a dangerous card to put in our queue, but we're gonna play it anyway.
Probably one of the best, like arguably one of the best cards in the set.
Dangerous in a way that makes me frisky.
So this is Chthonian Nightmare. So it is 1 and a black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you gain 3 energy. You can pay X energy and sacrifice a creature. You return Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand, and then return target creature with mana value of X to the graveyard, to the battlefield, activate only as a sorcery. So this is a callback to Recurring Nightmare, which is a card that is, last I checked, still played in Vintage Cube, although it's not quite as broken as it used to be. The thing is, this card shaves an entire mana off of the cost. And one of the problems with Recurring Nightmare is it is frequently very clunky because your curves in these powerful formats have gotten lower and lower. And this is true of our environment as well. We play very few 4+ cost cards. Almost everything in our cube is 3 or less. So in this context, I actually am kind of concerned, but I really want to test this card because it looks sweet. But I actually think this card's just better than Recurring Nightmare in our environment. I think like if you could put both the cards in our cube, this would just be better. Most of the cards are going to be cheaper. If you want to scale up to a 4 or a 5 drop, there are plenty of good 1s and 2s to bring back. And there's some looping sort of things you can do in the mid game once you've got 4, 5, 6 mana available to you that I keep bringing up these like black-white sack decks that I think have been underperforming lately. And I think they have so many new tools in this environment that I think they're going to be really powerful. If you don't have a counter spell up the turn they resolve this as a control deck, you probably fall super far behind, right? They're going to generate a huge amount of advantage off of just cycling through their creatures, doming you for damage and generating little residual amounts of value. I think that this card, one of the things that I do like about it a lot, though, is the safety valve of it's kind of hard to just flip like a Grave Titan into play. You can conceivably do it. And maybe even in the first turn, maybe it just ends up being that that's like a line that's pretty common. But it feels like the kind of card that you kind of have to work to do something silly like that, whereas a lot of it's going to be nickel and dime value, which I think is pretty sweet.
Yeah, I think even in the nickel and dime value case, though, like even if you just imagine something as mundane as like having this and Sanguine Evangelist, just Sanguine Evangelist, make a bat, attack in with the battle cry, it dies, make a bat, sack a bat, return Sanguine Evangelist to the battlefield. Just
yeah,
yeah. The card's probably cracked, and there's a bunch of good 2-mana creatures that are totally worth 2 mana to recur. And then if your Hostile Investigator or your Rankle or something dies later, you've got extra energy lying around to just reanimate that for 2 mana. So yeah, there's a lot going on here. I expect we will ban this.
I am right there with you. I think it's kind of funny. They did this thing in Modern Horizons 3 where they took some really traditionally powerful cards and they made energy versions of them so that they're like more specific. And I think they ended up doing that thing where they're like, we're going to make fixed versions of these broken cards, but they accidentally just made different broken versions of those cards. So you've got like the Recurrent Nightmare, you've got the Allure in green, you've got the Red Wheel of Fortune, and it's just like these cards are all like kind of broken in general. But yeah, I don't know why they're messing around in this territory, because this card just reads like it's insanely strong, and I imagine, like you said, we will probably not be playing it for long. We want it to be proven to us that it's too good before we cut it.
Too sweet not to try. Like there's no effect in the arena card pool that even vaguely approximates this. So while I am confident that someone is going to get dumpstered with it and we are going to hear some
choice words
about it, it's too sweet for us to not like make us like want it to ruin somebody's day a couple times before we ban it.
So our last black card here is Spy Master's Vault. There's actually a cycle of monocolored lands that operate kind of like the castles from Throne of Eldraine, where they come in untapped if you control a correspondent basic. So Spy Master's Vault comes in untapped if you control another swamp. It taps to add black, so assuming this comes in untapped, it's just better than a swamp already. And then it has an activated ability of black, tap it, target creature you control connives X, where X is the number of creatures that died this turn. The reason we're talking about this and some of the other lands we'll talk about is because the opportunity cost is almost nothing. Like, it will come in tapped some amount of the time, especially if you're being greedy with your mana or you don't have shocks or something like that. But most of the time it'll come in untapped and it'll just give you maybe some incidental value later on. Like if a creature died and you just get to connive with one of your creatures, that seems perfectly fine. Or if you're in a sacrifice deck and you can actually do something where you're sacrificing like 2 or 3 creatures in a turn, and then your leftover thing that you're planning to attack with, you get to like connive with that 3 times. That seems fine.
Perhaps if there was a card that could sack your board and make mana while it was doing so, that would be really handy with this, wouldn't it?
Yeah, if there was something like that, if only.
I actually expect this card to impress us.
Where do you think it'll be impressive?
Black proactive decks. When an aggro deck is like smorking into its opponent, right? Like necessarily your opponent. I mean, not necessarily, but like assuming like a regular game of Magic, like some creatures are going to need to get traded off if your opponent wants to survive. You can play this post combat, so they don't even necessarily see that it's coming when they're deciding to make trades. And if I like in the later game, if I'm like I've got like a Blood Artist on board and I'm just like smorking with some stuff, like I know some of it's going to be like a chump attack or whatever, and I'm just like throwing it in there so it can slam into some stuff and get some drains. if my only follow-up play after that is to like play a cheap creature because it's all that there is in my hand, and let's say like two of my creatures died and one of their creatures traded, like that, I think that that's actually like a very reasonable example, and you're going to be in a lot of situations where there's more death on board than that in a turn. If I just like play this for turn and like connive 4 on the blood gas that just came back from my graveyard because I just played a land, like that's sick. And the other thing is, like, specifically in black, like black, at least in our design, and I think a lot of designs, has creatures that you do not mind discarding. Connive is very good specifically in black for that reason. I think this is going to be straight up solid.
Yeah, I think the opportunity cost on this is low enough, and the upside is substantially higher than something like Takenuma. Like, this will push you through Flood in your grindy decks. This will let you potentially set up really awkward combats for your opponent where you, like, because this isn't a sorcery speed effect, you can do stuff like, all right, Doomblade, you're one guy, now a creature has died, so I'm going to, you know, put a Connive on there, I'm going to discard a card, give a counter, now I win a combat, and, like, that's not really a niche line. That's just something that's going to happen when you play this card. So, like, I think this card is going to run in the realm of like solid. I don't expect it to be some sort of world beater, but there's a lot of cool play to it. I like these cards that decrease the number of non-games, which this sort of does. It doesn't do it early, right? So I guess those non-games will still happen, but those sort of mid-game draws where, you know, you're playing, where you're me and I send you a picture where I've drawn 8 cards and all of them were lands. You know, maybe those happen slightly less often.
Mm-hmm. Oh, you know what's actually funny? I doubt this will come up very often, but like this interacts interestingly with First Strike, right? Because if there's First Strike damage and things die, then you can connive. Yeah. That's like a very small edge, but that just occurred to me.
Yeah, so in your Rakdos breaches, let's go.
And again, you know, everything driving this conversation is just so low opportunity cost to put in a deck. Assuming that you're playing like a healthy number of swamps. But that does wrap up black for us. And red, another color that I think is getting quite a bit to talk about here. Starting off with a pair of really good 2-drops, which I'm going to let I'm going to let Chris take this first one because I know he's excited about it. And then if y'all don't mind, I would like to take the little dino boy.
Absolutely. So Reckless Pyrosurfer is 1 and a red for a 2/2 human scout. I like the art a great deal. It's a get you dude from Dominaria surfing on a rock on some magma. I think we all wish we could do that from time to time. So 2/2 human scout, haste, landfall. Whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control, this gains Battle Cry until end of turn. Battle Cry is when a creature has it attacks, all of your other creatures get +1/+0. So notably, like, this isn't as smorking as a 3/2 every time you play a land. You need other creatures for it to be anything other than like a 2/2 haster. But what I do like about this card is that early in the game, it's just like a 2/2 haste. However, like if you get an attack with a 2/2 haste and there's no trading going on, then it's just like a 2/2 with Battle Cry for every turn that you play land after that, which I think is pretty solid for 2. And a lot of like aggressive red 2-drops suffer from just not really being something that you want to top later in the game. But if I know that this is in my deck, and I'm on 4 or 5 mana, and I have lands in hand, like, rather than just playing them out, like, I now have an incentive to hold those lands, because I could potentially top Reckless Pyrosurfer, play land, buff my board that already exists, and that could be the difference between lethal and not lethal. I also like red creatures that interact well with going wide, because I think it adds new dimensions to Boros. Like, more red cards interact well with white's ability to go wide. Like, we got War Leader's Call in Boros recently, etc. So this just has like a lot of things that I like. It's not the most super powerful card on the planet or whatever, but I think that this is an engaging 2-drop. And like, obviously this is like not going to happen all the time, but if you're playing a 2-color aggro deck and you draw like one of your fetches late, you just hold it, and occasionally this is going to be +2/+0 on your already onboard creatures, just like out of nowhere, and in a lot of situations your opponent's just going to die to that, I think.
Yeah, this card reminds me a little bit of a card that came out over like a decade ago or whatever at this point, but it was called Goblin War Driver out of Mirrodin Besieged. And that card was much, much worse than this, just to be clear. It was red for a 2/2 with Battle Cry, did not have haste, much harder to cast. That being said, when that card was spoiled, I recall people being very, very excited about how busted it was, and then it performed acceptable in Goblins and nowhere else. And my kind of thoughts on this is there are so many 2/3s floating around that I have to assume that this card is going to look better than it plays. That being said, I also think this card is still good. Like, that is not me poo-pooing on this card. It is just kind of hard for me to get excited about a card that doesn't attack for 3 because there are so many 2/3s floating around. I think maybe I'm wrong on that, and it just ends up being a good aggressive card. Like, obviously, if your opponent stumbles and, like, they miss their 2-drop, you start cracking in with this. It's going to be really, really good. I just think that this is the kind of card that, like, could be a little bit overrated, could cause people to miss sequence trying to, like, hold a land when they should be playing it, though that's obviously pilot error. That has nothing to do with the card. But I think this card is more in the camp of, like, totally fine tester card as opposed to, like, something that I'm pretty confident will be good or, like, sticking around for a long time.
I have a suspicion this is going to be good. I think 2-mana 2/2 haste is, like, still, like, a rock-solid stat line for, like, a red aggressive creature. I mean, we have, like, Robber of the Rich, Coyote, things like that. You can take or leave whichever ones you like, but, like, the fact that those are 2-mana 2/2 haste is usually the thing driving the conversation with those cards, and then they occasionally have some extra upside, which does or doesn't matter. This is a little worse than just, like, 2-mana 2/2 haste, play a land, all your creatures get +1/+0 because it has to attack in order to actually reap the benefits of its ability. So if it's in a position where you can't attack, like, obviously it's not doing anything, but it's also the type of card that, like, can push so much damage in a single turn when your opponent wasn't accounting for it that you just swing a game in your favor, right? Like, yeah, you played on turn 2, you hit for 2 a couple times, maybe you, like, trade it off and get a couple extra points. But if your opponent's, like, trying to calculate math and trying to play to small margins and, you know, they left back, like, 1 blocker or whatever, and you untap, play this, play another creature with haste or something, play a land, pump your whole team, suddenly they're taking, like, 6-7 damage when they thought they were only taking, like, 2 or whatever. So I think this has some pretty good late game implications while being a good 2-drop, and I expect this card to perform, like, fine. I don't think it's going to be our best red 2-drop or anything like that, but I think it's going to be quite good. And obviously fetch lands, right? Fetch lands, giving it double instances of Battle Cry. Battle Cry does stack, so that's going to be really powerful as well.
I can see this being a really explosive card too. Like, it is possible that this is the kind of card that, like, these sort of aggressive creature decks have been looking for. It's definitely better than a lot of the versions of this sort of kind of card that we've seen in the past. I think this card is probably fine. I think I'm a little bit lower on it than you two are, but not much.
I think it should be good. The next 2-drop here, I think, is actually just, like, certifiably broken to the point where I don't think we're actually going to play it in either of our cubes, but we should still talk about the card's existence. It's Amped Raptor, just, like, super amped up. 1 in a red for a 2/1. It's an uncommon dinosaur with first strike. So 2-mana 2/1 first strike, decent floor. When it enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy counters. Then, if you cast it from your hand, you exile from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card. You may cast it by paying an amount of energy equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So, just to break that down real quick, assuming you have no other energy floating around or energy cards in your deck, this is a 2-mana 2/1 first strike that has the opportunity to flip into another spell. It is not like Cascade. It will not always hit. It just goes until it hits whatever the next non-land card is, and if you have enough energy to cover its mana cost, you get to cast that spell essentially for free by paying energy instead. If you only have 2 energy and you flip into a 3-drop, you're out of luck. You don't get to cast that card. It just remains exiled. But there are a couple things you can do. First off, if you do have extra energy floating around, it broadens the scope of things that you can hit with this. Second, if you are able to construct your deck in a way where you only have 1-drops and 2-drops, this will always hit. And I personally think, like, if you're playing a red aggro deck and you have, let's say, like, 5 cards in the 3 or 4-drop sections, you've got, like, your Rekindling Phoenix, your Bone Crusher Giant, your Breaches, whatever. If the majority of your deck is 1 and 2s, but you still have some 3s and 4s, I still think this is just an incredible card, and if it misses, so what? But you have a high percentage of just hitting anyway. So, like, if you take this card in a draft and you know that you have it, like, obviously you're going to sculpt your deck a little bit more to hit with this more consistently, but I don't think you even need to do that much because they push this card as just a 2-mana 2/1 first strike. The fail case of the card is still a perfectly fine creature, and then when it does hit, it's just like an incredible creature. It's a 2-mana 2/1 that comes in with another 1-drop or 2-drop. Maybe that's a removal spell, maybe that's another creature, whatever. You know, we panned the Ajani from the set for being a 2-mana 1/2 that comes in with a 2/1, and Amped Raptor is, like, very often going to be even better than that. It's going to be a 2/1 that hits another 2-drop and just puts it directly into play on turn 2. Like, kind of crazy. So I think this card is, like, it has a fail case. of being kind of a dorky creature that misses some amount of the time. It's obviously insane in Constructed. It plays around with energy, which we're not going to really be messing around with energy that much in our cube. But as it stands, like, this is just going to lead to certain levels of variance that we're not super comfortable with, where sometimes it's going to be just a dorky 2-drop, and sometimes it's going to be like the best play that happened all game, and it happened on turn 2. So I'm a little cautious of this card for our cube. I think like the upper echelon of what this card can do is probably a little bit too strong.
Yeah, this just reads like the kind of card that I will see in as a 4 of in a bunch of Constructed decks. Like, it obviously doesn't play well with the Evoke Elementals or whatever, but it does play well with stuff like Kroxa. And
you're going to have decks with 4 of these and 4 Burning Tree Emissaries, and you're going to like Raptor into a Burning Tree Emissary to make the mana to cast another Raptor into whatever you hit off that one. And in Constructed, you'll never miss, right? Because you'll construct your deck to only have 1-drops and 2-drops. So this is an insane Constructed card.
Right, yeah. And for our purposes, though, I think most of our mono red decks tend to be really low curve. If you look, like most of the winning ones especially, it's just a pile of 1s and 2s and then like, 2-3 drops and a 4-drop, and that's like, that's it. And in those decks, this card would be incredible. It's possible we're supposed to play this just because aggro decks have been struggling lately, but also This is the kind of card that just reads to me like nobody is going to be having a good time when this hits, and nobody's going to be having a good time when this misses.
This card is definitely there on power level, right? Like, the 4 being a 2-1 first strike is not good. I'm not playing that card, but like, that's not holy shit embarrassing, especially since, as we've discussed on the show a bunch of times, first strike is maximized in red just because of instant speed burn. You can do things in combat with first strike. I think the middle case is going to be like, play this, hit like a 1-mana burn spell, which if you don't have like a target to kill with the 1-mana burn spell, maybe it just goes face, so it's kind of like a Viashino Pyromancer with first strike, which is a card I think we would play, actually. What I do not like is the situations that have already been kind of outlined, which is like on turn 2 on the play, I play this card, I flip Inti and put Inti on board, and my opponent is just like, fuck you. Like, are you serious, man? Fuck you. That's my hesitation. It's clearly powerful enough, and red could use a powerful card. I just don't like the variance. And I don't even mean the variance like sometimes it's not going to hit. Like, you build your curve really, really low intentionally so that the variance on hitting something is not the issue. It's the variance of like, here's a fine 2-drop, and then I cleared a land off the top of my library that I didn't need to draw next turn, hit my next best 2-drop, and played that. Like, I think people are just going to be really frustrated with that play pattern. That being said, the more that we've talked about this card, the more I'm like, maybe we should try it. Maybe we should see what it does. I just don't like the spectrum of fine to holy shit, I guess I'll scoop that this card represents.
So red does need powerful cards, though, and I do think they gave us one that I think could be pretty gross, and I think you're right there with me, Tim, right?
Before we get started, the name on this card is incredibly stupid, and I'm not sure that I understand the flavor at all, but okay.
But you actually, in addition to getting your hat, you get issued 1 standard issue Phoenix when you become a detective on Ravnica.
I don't get it either. I think this started with the design, and then they're like, "Oh, collect evidence." That was the thing in the detective. Like, I think that's how they got there. I don't think there's
Detectives Phoenix. Yeah,
there's no top-down design here.
Detectives Phoenix is a red and 2 colorless for a enchantment creature Phoenix. It is a 2/2 with flying and haste and has bestow. So bestow is a mechanic from original Theros that allows you to cast the creature as an enchantment. Usually it gives its stats or something similar to the creature it's enchanting. In this case, you bestow for a single red mana, and you need to collect evidence 6 as part of the cost. So you'll need to exile 6 mana value worth of cards from your graveyard. The enchanted creature gets +2/+2 as well as flying and haste. So it gets the keywords that the Phoenix has as well as its stats in this case. And you may cast Detective's Phoenix from your graveyard for its bestow cost. Now, one of the cool things about bestow as well is that once the creature that it targeted is removed, resolved or not, you get the card back, right? Your Phoenix goes into play. So the way this works is you bestow this onto a creature dies, you get your Phoenix eventually dies, and then you can bestow it from your graveyard to do the whole thing over and over again. Oftentimes, you're going to have to play this out as a Windrake with haste on the front end, which is not exactly exciting. But the upside on this one is an extremely powerful combat enhancing enchantment that also, if the creature dies, gives you another 2/2. So very, very powerful if you're able to play other cards and then make your first play with this card, bestowing it from your hand. Notably, LTR Land Cyclers enable this because all of them except for Lawyer and Revealed cost 6. So if you discard your Oliphant on turn 1, you play a good 2-drop on turn 2, and then, you could follow it up with like 2-drop plus this on turn 3, for example, bestowed to give your creature haste and push a bunch of damage. Card is just very, very powerful, it seems like. Again, kind of a wide range of how good exactly it is. But I think in as long as you have other cards to play, you're just going to hold this card and you're going to bestow it at some point, give a creature haste, and jump it up into the air and deal a ton of damage out of nowhere. Your opponent's going to have to come up with 2 removal spells because you've got so much evasion. We've talked about red needing evasive creatures, and this makes multiple evasive bodies, which seems awesome.
I think this card's insane. I think this card's incredible. The 3-mana mode, like playing this on turn 3 is pretty weak. That's like a Sky Knight Legionnaire. But you're okay with whatever happens to it because your long-term plan is to stick this on a different creature later down the line. And odds are you probably don't even play this on 3. You just play your other cards, and you just try to bestow this from your hand, or you try to loot it away and bestow it from your graveyard without ever actually casting it as a 3-mana creature. But it gives haste and flying for 1 mana when you actually get to do it, assuming you can get the collect evidence. So like the standard case that me and Teld both thought of was like your Doomscar Warrior, just a run-of-the-mill 4-drop in green. Later in the game, you play your Doomscar Warrior, you bestow onto it, you smack your opponent for 6, and you get the Doomscar Warrior trigger. And this isn't even like a far-fetched example, right? Now your opponent has to kill this 6/6 flying creature that already hit you once. If they do, you just get a 2/2 flyer. It just dies into a 2/2 flyer. And they also put that creature in the graveyard so that when they actually deal with the Phoenix again, you now have more evidence in your graveyard to just play it on the next big creature. So I think this is like the actual creature part of this card as like a 3-mana play is like pretty weak. So you should be looking at the bestow cost. But as a bestow, like a creature here, as a bestow aura or whatever you want to call it, this is like a really incredible card. We used to mess around with like Demonic Embrace, and I always thought that card was kind of good. I think it costs like 3 life and a card to bring it back from your graveyard, and you just get like free stuff off of this creature while also making something like a must kill. And if they can't kill it, they just die. Like you could slap this on Hazaret and be like, haha, like I'm gonna hit you for 7 in the air every turn on my indestructible flying. I guess it already has haste, like the fact that the bestow cost only charges you 1 mana despite eating a big chunk of your graveyard, I think is a pretty big deal here. So I do think this card is like pretty strong, pretty incredible.
The keywords this give are ridiculous too. Like flying and haste is just that is some chef's kiss damage pushing. Yeah, card seems really powerful. We tested it. We messed around with Convenient Target, and we've messed around the idea of like some cards like Demonic Ruckus in the past as well. Just kind of theory crafting them. This card blows all those cards out of the water.
Yeah, though it is worth mentioning, like you will not always be able to collect evidence. Like this is not always online, so I think that tempers it a little bit. So collect evidence 6 is a pretty big number for red decks, I think.
Yeah, you're probably going to have to collect like 3 to 4 cards in order to enable this. So there's going to be a limit, probably once or twice per game you bestow this, but I think the upside here is just still so incredible.
I wanted to just lump the removal together, and then we can talk about it as kind of like a package, but red is actually getting a decent amount of good removal in this set. So 3 cards to kind of lump together real quick. There's Galvanic Discharge, which is a single red mana for an instant. Choose a creature or planeswalker. You get 3 energy, and then you can pay any amount of energy to deal that much damage to that permanent. So this is essentially instant speed Strangle, with the upside that you can like preserve some energy for some other effect. But for our purposes, instant speed Strangle. There's Ghostfire Slice, which is 2 in a red for an uncommon instant with Devoid. It costs 2 less to cast if an opponent controls a multicolored permanent, and it deals 4 damage to any target. So you can just cast that as 3 mana, 4 damage to anything, but if your opponent has a multicolored permanent anywhere on their board, it costs a single mana for 4 damage at instant speed. And notably, it doesn't have to target the multicolored permanent they have, they just have to control one. And then there's also Fanged Flames, which is 1 in a red for a sorcery with Devoid, and it's the Obliterate and Bolt text. It deals 4 damage to a creature or planeswalker, and it exiles it, it dies. That one's only really notable here, because if you want a second Obliterate and Bolt, you have it, but it's also a common. so it's like pauper playable. But we've got a nice little suite of removal here. I don't know which ones you guys are like most excited for. I think the Ghostfire Slice is nice. Just 4 damage to the dome is really good, and it punishes those like greedy Omnath decks. But Instant Speed Strangle is also a pretty powerful card.
Yeah, these are all good cards. Fanged Flames is mostly just for density or for pauper, like you said. The other two are both, I don't want to say best in slot effects, but they're kind of in that range of like very, very good for what you're paying, especially if you play Ghostfire Slice for 1 mana. That being said, at the end of the day, these are removal spells. We get a bunch of these every set. These just happen to be particularly good ones.
The slice is nice. 3 mana go anywhere, solid. It's not like a great rate, but it's fine. And then I think it's like totally playable. These days, I think with Face Burn, like I'm fine actually paying a little bit more for it if I get more damage out of the card to make the card itself like more relevant. And multicolor permanents tend to be powerful. So if your opponent controls one, this being better Lightning Bolt is a nice little reward. So not a whole lot to say. Ghostfire Slice is the most dynamic of them, and I think it's actively pretty cool.
Yep, and that's the red removal corner for this review. So we'll go ahead and take a break and listen to a message from our sponsors.
Raid Shadow Legends.
Yeah, I already did the bit once. There is one more red card to talk about here, actually. It is a land called Arena of Glory. It's a rare land. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a mountain. It taps to add red mana, and then it's got this really cool red ability. Red, tap it, and exert it, which means you tap it, but it won't untap during its next untap step. And you add red to your mana pool. If that mana is spent on a creature spell, it gains haste until end of turn. So you'll note, like, the refund here is exactly what you're paying into it. You're tapping essentially 2 lands to get 2 red mana, and you're giving up a mana on your next turn. But you're not ramping, you're not down mana, you're just net even on mana for the opportunity to give a creature haste for quote-unquote free at the cost of like being down a mana on the next turn. It's been noted by a couple people you can double dip. If you're able to use each of those red mana on 2 separate creatures, you can give 2 creatures haste in the same turn, which is not like irrelevant. And again, low opportunity cost. All you need is a mountain for this to come in untapped, so this should come in untapped pretty much all the time, and if it doesn't, like, it's a tap land that still has relevant text. So I like this one. I think this is a really cool design, good use of exert on a non-creature permanent, really clever design as well. I think this is a really cool card.
It's great. And depending on the design of your red section, a lot of your red creatures are going to have haste anyway, but some of them aren't, like Rekindling Phoenix. The Rabblemaster variants, hasting a Legion Warboss with like an open attack is obviously good value. Breachy Boy, yep. And, you know, it was mentioned, like, we need some more cards that are exciting to play in Gruul decks, and I think this is, like, actively a lot better in a Gruul deck.
Inferno Titan.
Inferno Titan, yeah. If you're in, like, a mid-rangey Rakdos deck, you can haste Aquazots with this. You can haste Grave Titan with this. And the other thing is, like, you exert the land, but in the mid-game, exerting the land might actually just not cost you any tempo.
Yeah.
Depending on how many resources in your hand, how many lands you have on board. Like, I think in the later game, especially if you're in a top deck or top deck adjacent scenario, this is literally just any big creature that you draw in the later game has haste, and it has virtually no cost to you whatsoever.
This particularly gets interesting, too, with some cards like Sanguine Evangelist, for example. Giving that haste is decent. Stuff like Svalin or even Drana in these different, like, if you're moving into different colors. There's a number of cards that like, surprise they have haste is actually quite powerful. So, yeah, it's pretty interesting. I mean, it's a way of giving your Kogla and Yadaro haste while also killing something the turn it comes down. So, you know, a lot you can do with this. Yeah, seems like a solid card. Like, you obviously, you know, have to be in a position where you can let your land exert, but as long as you're there, like, it's kind of free rolled into your mana base if you've got enough red sources.
Yeah, this is a very cool design. So we got green coming up here. I actually have to step away for about like 90 seconds, which feels like a perfect time to go ahead and pass this cleverly designed, awesome green mana dork to Chris to talk about. And I assume he will still be talking about it when I come back. So Chris,
I'll probably still be reading the text when you come back.
I'm just going to mute myself and let Chris take this over. Go ahead.
Take it away.
Fanatic of Ronus. You can hear how excited I am. Fanatic of Ronus, 1 and a green for a 1/4 Snake Druid. Ferocious. Tap, add green. Activate only if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, and eternalize 2 green green, and eternalizes you exile this from your graveyard at sorcery speed to create a 4/4. So let's break it down. It is a 4 toughness, 2-drop, which aggro decks don't like. I don't know if you've heard about that. It adds a single green. That, as a card, is not exciting, but a 1/4 dork that doesn't die to bolts that it blocks well and adds green mana is fine. It adds 4 mana if you control a creature with power 4 or greater, which is insane. And if you eternalize it, it itself is a 4/4. So if you're not in a position where you want to smork with your 4/4, you can just tap it. When you eternalize it, it's a 4 mana 4/4 that adds green, 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 green. Like, that's the card. It's busted. There's not really a whole lot else to say about it. It's busted. This, like the Soul Trader in black, it is a print that is screaming that everything about this was tuned to show up in a viable modern deck. I'm assuming that's why it has 4 toughness. This card is just good generically on its own. It ramps early, it blocks. If it dies, you can eternalize it. Honestly, if this was just 1 and a green for a 1/4 tap add green with eternalize 2 green green, that would be sick. But occasionally you're going to do stupid shit, like you're going to play this on turn 2, and then you're going to untap on turn 3. You're going to play like a Bloated Contaminator or some other overstated 3-drop like Lovestruck Beast, and then you're just going to tap this, and you're just going to play Questing Beast on the same turn, and the game's just going to be over. This is good enough for your cube, probably. If you're doing any kind of green ramp thing at all that cares about creatures, this is good enough for your cube, straight up. We are not going to put it into our own cube because this is occasionally just going to turn 3 goldfish the game, and there's not going to be anything your opponent can do about it.
This is the best 2-mana Mandor probably ever printed. There's a few like Rofalos that like can argue to be better, but this is just in that top echelon of absolutely ridiculous 2-mana Mandors.
Yeah, I'm assuming whatever you said covered anything I would need to say about it. So let's go ahead and move on to the long-awaited sequel to 5. It's really weird to see a card name that's just 6. The name of the card is
They really
6.
they really need to start a movie franchise because they like making 7 movies in a single franchise now because Hollywood's completely run out of ideas. Like, we just need to release a movie just called One.
One. While I IMDb how many movies there are called One, does somebody want to talk to us about 6 sans Ren? No Ren here, it's just 6 on his own, I guess.
Ren was just riding around on 6 all the time, demanding things, wanting to go places. Like, 6 was just like, I'm not a fucking car, dude, and just ditched him. So.
Does not have mounts or crew, so you are correct. Not a vehicle, confirmed.
Oh, this card should have had saddle, but like no saddle effect. Like, you can just saddle it,
Just
but
saddle.
It doesn't actually do anything when you do.
So 6 is a 3 mana, so 2 and a green for a 2/4 legendary tree folk with reach. 2, again, 4 toughness, aggro deck, not exactly excited. Whenever 6 attacks, you mill 3 cards, and then you may put a land from among them into your hand. So mill, not optional. This will deck you out fairly quickly if you choose to attack with it. And you also can't pick up lands that were already in your graveyard. It has to be one of the 3 that you milled. And then as long as it is your turn, non-land permanent cards in your graveyard have Retrace, which if you have not played with the mechanic before, you may cast them from your graveyard by discarding a land card in addition to their other costs. So this generates value when you attack with it. It blocks really well when you don't. And then the value that it generates, if you no longer need to make land drops, you can just instead cast spells out of your graveyard, which, by the way, is self-enabled by milling you. Really, really powerful value engine. This one's kind of scary. I think it's a little more fair than some of the other really, really broken engine cards that we've talked about and will continue to talk about down the road. But still a very powerful card that will either block pretty well or generate a ton of value over the course of a game.
This seems strong. Retrace for any permanent in your graveyard is kind of a hell of an ability. The one kind of caveat to that being that if you're discarding lands to retrace, you're often in a position where you're not developing your mana anymore, so there's like a little bit of trade-off, but obviously like once you get to the late game and you have 5-6 lands on board, this just lets you cash in any land that you draw for any permanent in your graveyard, which is kind of incredible.
I don't understand how from a flavor perspective this works, because if you have Wrenn and 6, this plays really well with it, right? Because you pick up lands with your Wrenn and 6 so that you can retrace cards with your 6, but there's 2 6s in play, and then the multiverse breaks down.
We'll save that for the flavor review. But I mean, this is also that coveted 3-mana 2/4 body that's been like not at all problematic in recent Magic. So
what I do like about this, it's got to attack, right? This has to attack.
Yes.
Like Preacher of the Schism could just swing, and if you're behind, it just makes a 1/1 life-linking blocker. So, get fucked. And Sentinel of the Nameless City has Vidge. So this seemingly now standard for toughness on a 3-drop creature, but you do have to, against aggressive decks, if you want to do the drawing cards milling thing, you have to attack. That being said, it's still probably nuts because it's a great blocker, and like if you've already got stuff going on in your graveyard, it can just sit there and just redraw anything in your graveyard at will. I do like that this value engine type thing, I think, grinds well into blue, which is a problem green has for us right now. This is very strong.
Yeah. Chris, I'm going to let you talk about the next one because I think probably to some amount of our listeners, this one isn't as obvious of a card to even be talking about, but I think we're all on board with this kind of being maybe a sleeper card in the set. Maybe it's not that good, but maybe it's a sleeper card.
Yeah, so I noticed this card in the common dump and posted it to design group, and I think like it was like the middle of spoilers or whatever, so you guys might have missed that I did that, and then Teld later was like, hey, this seems pretty good, right? And that's where I was at on it. So this is Eldrazi Repurposer. It is 2 and a green for an Eldrazi drone at common. It's a 3/3 with Devoid. Whenever you cast the spell and when Eldrazi Repurposer dies, create a 0/1 colorless Eldrazi spawn creature token with sacrifice this creature, add 1 colorless mana. So this is a common, and commons don't usually make the cut in higher power cubes if they cost more than 2. But I really like this for a couple of reasons. First of all, 3 mana, 3/3, whatever, it's a Centaur Courser, but that's still an acceptable body, and then it comes with a token that you can sack to make mana. So if you want to double spell on a turn, this is kind of like a 2 mana 3/3, which isn't breaking anything, right? But you don't have to fire the mana off immediately. Like this is just a 3 mana 3/3 that ramps you into your 5-drop the next turn if you draw and play another land. And it also makes one when it dies. So if I play this on turn 3 and my aggressive opponent needs to bolt it or whatever to continue to push damage and it dies, I untap the next turn. I have 2 Scions. I have 2 Lotus Petals in play now. You traded a card for my 3/3, and if I make a land drop, I just can untap and play 6/6. In green-white, the bodies don't have Defender, so if I don't need the mana and I have something like Intrepid Adversary or Wedding Announcement going on, like these are actual bodies that can attack and block. The first trigger is on cast rather than ETB, so if my control opponent counters it, because they don't want the 3/3 body on board, beating them down, I still get a Lotus Petal, not a Lotus Petal, but you take my point out of the deal. I actually just think this is really good.
Yeah, so I think the immediate comparison people are going to, particularly people who don't think this card is good, are going to jump to is Jewel Thief, which was an SNC common that was a 3/3 for 3 that ETB'd made a treasure and had Trample and Vigilance. This notably doesn't fix your mana, and it doesn't have those combat keywords, but I think the fact that this makes actual creatures that can block when you need them to in those spots, and the fact that you get a second one on the way out do make this card better for our kind of environment. Also, I do like that it doesn't have Vigilance. I actually really don't like green creatures with Vigilance simply because it makes it impossible for your aggressive deck to attack into them. But I think this card has enough edges over a card like Jewel Thief for our particular environment that I think it is a notch above it, which finally gets it over that hurdle. Because I think like if you put Jewel Thief in a cube, I don't think it's necessarily worth the slot in a powerful environment, but also I'm not going to like lose my mind because it's usually like an okay-ish rate, right? If you're not playing cards like Sentinel of the Nameless City.
It doesn't have the keyword and it doesn't fix, but I think the fact that if I play this and then I trade it off for a card, whether that's a creature, removal spell, or whatever, this was effectively, in terms of over the entire game tempo, a 1 mana 3/3. I think that makes me like it. We've also talked about this, like when we talked about the Messenger in blue earlier. If I have instant speed removal in my hand, during combat, I can block something large with the token, thereby gaining life, and then sacrifice it to make like a Doomblade that I'm holding affordable mid-combat. I think that this is actually probably pretty solid.
Yeah, this is not a revolutionary card, but it's probably something that's going to be overlooked by most people. I don't even think it's a must play, but it's easy to overlook because it is just a common.
Adult Gold Dragon?
This could be Adult Gold Dragon. This is a rock solid, easy to understand text box. I like it. Teld, you added a couple green mythics to the list you want to talk about here real quick?
Yeah. These aren't for us, but just wanted to just shout them out real quick. There's Grist Voracious Larva, which is 1 green, like a singular green mana for a 1/2 Death Toucher, which is totally fine. Whenever Grist or another creature enters the battlefield under your control, if it entered from the graveyard or you cast it from the graveyard, you may pay a green. If you do, you exile it, return it to the battlefield, flipped under its owner's control. So it flips into a Planeswalker that has... I don't have the flip side posted on here, but the other side...
Yeah, it's basically make a 1/1, and then if you milled over a black permanent, it gets a death touch counter, and then the minus is like pop an artifact enchantment.
Yeah, just a really good rate for 1 mana. It feels like the kind of card that's really pushed for constructed, but will be cool if you're doing kind of like a graveyard synergy cube or something like that. It's got a lot of play to it, and the floor being like a 1 mana death toucher with more than 1 toughness is pretty good. The other one that I think is more exciting for the cubes we tend to play on Arena is Eladamri Corvidal, which is green 1 for a 3/3 legendary creature elf warrior. You may look at the top card of your library at any time. You may cast creature spells from the top of your library, and then you can pay a green, tap it and 2 other untapped creatures you control, and then reveal a card from your hand or the top of the library. If you reveal a creature card this way, you may put it onto the battlefield and activate it during your turn. So this feels like a timeless card where this sort of sneak attack style deck, channel style deck where you're playing, Dorks and Ulamogs and Eldrazi and stuff like that. This is just going to be a card that, like, it's a nice little value generating play that you play this and like untap win, right? You just reveal like an Ulamog from your hand or an Emrakul from your hand and slam it into play, and the game is over.
Do you know why there's a comma in Eladamri's name? Eldamri, Corvigdal is Corvig.
I'm assuming that Corvigdal is supposed to be like some elvish.
Yeah, is it like maybe a title for like king or something?
Not their name.
I don't know if you guys knew the lore there or not. Quick one here. Horrific Assault is a single green mana for a sorcery at common. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to a creature or planeswalker you don't control. If you control an Eldrazi, you gain 3 life. We actually just got Hard Hidden Question like 2 sets ago, and this is like technically strictly better, though if you don't have Eldrazi, it's just Hard Hidden Question number 2, and it's got some really cool art. So we're on this one for right now. Not much else to say about it other than it's an efficient green removal spell.
I do just want to hop one note in here. I think people in general, as a heuristic, are just really against playing like bites and fights in their cubes because it's like, oh, it gets blown out by removal, yada, yada, yada. This is the classic thing where people assume that your opponent always has Doomblade in hand and never taps out and always has access to it. And like bite for 2 mana is not particularly good. What makes bites for 1 mana, especially bites that hit planeswalkers, so good is because it only costs 1 mana, you can play out a creature just like one cut off curve and then just immediately fire this off because your opponent tapped out for whatever, and at that point it's just 1 mana Doomblade. Or 1 mana like Hero's Downfall, So when bites get efficient enough, when they're this efficient, like they start to get really good. So if your green decks are having some trouble interacting in your cubes and you're wondering whether or not a 1 mana bite is good enough, I can virtually guarantee you that it is.
Hard Hidden Questions justified itself too. I think it's pretty good.
Yeah, Hard Hidden Questions been pretty good. Real quick, guys, little lore dump that Tim can appropriately place. Corvec Dahl was a prophesized uniter who was going to apparently unite 3 tribes, the Corvec and Dahl of Wrath, and they thought it was Gerard, but afterwards they realized it was actually Eladamri, and so he is some sort of like unified prophesized king type thing.
Oh, it's like the Ilkor, the Envec, the Endal type thing.
Yeah, that thing.
Oh, that's
just keep going back to the well, huh?
Yeah, sweet. Thanks for looking that up. I'm going to talk about a less exciting card that we actually think is pretty decent, but Malevolent Rumble, dumb name, is 1 in a green for a common.
It should have been Royal Rumble. It should have been Royal Rumble, and everyone knows it.
But then we would be complaining that sounds like a fight spell. Let's be honest.
If this is your attempt to subvert expectations, Wizards, there is a not hacky way to subvert expectations, and this was not it.
Yeah, it is weird that it's Malevolent Rumble because there's nothing about this card that feels like something bad is happening. But 1 in a green, sorcery at common, reveal the top 4 cards of your library. You may put a permanent from among them into your hand, put the rest in your graveyard, and make an Eldrazi spawn token that can sack for colorless mana. So a lot of really small effects that probably adds up to a decent little card. Like think of this as a 2-mana 0/1 creature that, cantrips into a different permanent, fills your graveyard, and can even sacrifice for mana down the line. A lot of knobs.
This is good.
None of these individual effects is that good, but this is what we would refer to as like a use the whole Buffalo card. If you're able to get value out of sacrificing this for mana, or you're able to get value out of the cards that end up in your graveyard, like you would happily just play a cantrip that gives you a little bit of extra oomph for whatever your like minor like sub synergies are. So yeah, this seems like a decent little card without, again, being like revolutionary or must play or anything like that.
Yeah, I kind of like that this card, if you need it to be, you can use the mana this turn, and in which case it really only costed you a single green mana to dig 4 cards deep. So we're just looking at better impulse for green decks. And then if you can afford to wait a turn, you get to use it as a one-shot ramp spell, your Lotus Petal. You can use it to gain life by blocking with it. There's so many little things that this lets you do. I think this card is like kind of disguised as a 2-mana card, but it's flexibly like a 2-mana ramp / card selection spell that's also a modal 1-mana selection spell when you need it to be, which is quite good. I think the modality here, it's sort of hidden modality. You have to like read between the lines, but I think it's quite good.
Yeah, just generating the mana on that turn, so it's effectively like a 1-mana impulse that feeds the graveyard is good, and also just being able to do this knowing like full well that you'll be able to spend the Lotus Petal that makes the next turn to accelerate forward into whatever you found. I think this is very good green card selection.
Yeah, this is a sweet one. We have 2 green cards to close out with here. One's the MDFC Bridgeworks Battle. This is 2 and a green for a sorcery at uncommon. Target creature you control gets +2/+2 and fights up to 1 target creature you don't control. And then it has one of those lands where you can pay 3 life to have it come in untapped on the backside. I think this is the literal text box of Savage Smash on a monocolored card. And Savage Smash is like a fine card that you would never use a cube slot on. But like when you actually get to pull this off and it sticks, like you usually kill a creature and also like open up an attack that you otherwise would have had while also adding damage to that attack. So it is a pretty backbreaking card when you actually get to pull it off. It is an expensive fight. It's sorcery speed. So what Chris just said about fights with the hard-hitting question variant is true here as well, that people are a little hesitant to play fights, and the more expensive they get, the worse they get. But I think this one's fine. Again, this is very similar to the blue Unsubstantiate, the black removal spell. Maybe a little bit better or worse depending on what your opinion is, but just another removal spell you can slot into your mana base, and whether it's worth a cube slot or not, completely up to you as a cube designer, Not super exciting. Teld, talk to me about the green land here that you added. I think I agree that this might be like one of the best cards in the set, period, for things that we're not specifically doing.
Yeah, so the card is Shifting Woodlands. It enters the battlefield tapped unless you control a forest of this cycle. You can tap to add a green, and then you can pay 2 green. Does not have to tap to do this. And then it has Delirium, so it becomes a copy of target permanent card in your graveyard until end of turn. Activate only if there are 4 or more card types in your graveyard. So this card is almost certainly not for us. Like we could play it and it would do things. You could copy and make a Grave Titan or something like that, and it would be fine. But the real power of this card is when you start getting into those older formats and constructed. I think this card is a completely degenerate constructed card, but even in terms of cube, when you get into like vintage cube, where people sometimes run stuff like Depth Combo, or they'll put Omniscience in their cube and other just completely degenerate, Archons of Cruelty and things like that, where you're really doing some silly things with this card. It's going to be just like fitting into your mana base and just doing wild things. You can go fetch it up with Primeval Titan and then copy the Prime Time if you need to get more lands after they kill it. For some reason, I don't know why, this card doesn't exile the card you target. So like if you don't win the game the turn you do it, you need to do it again. You could just copy whatever you copied or again, which is absolutely wild. It doesn't tap. So like if you need to, you can tap this for mana and then turn it into a thing. So like if you're turning it into an enchantment or an artifact where you don't need it to be untapped, you really don't have to spend any extra mana, right? If you're turning it into a creature and you need to attack, it costs 4 plus this, but there are going to be a lot of spots where you turn this into something where it doesn't matter and it just literally costs you 4 mana. I don't know. This card is silly. Like it is not, like I said, probably not something we're really interested in because it does have some hoops you have to jump through in terms of deck building to really get there. It doesn't copy ETBs or anything like that. But just what this card is doing is just like kind of reads as fundamentally unfair.
Yeah, I agree that we could run this and like maybe occasionally it'd become a copy of like a Quest and Beast or something, but that's not like, that's just an incidental thing that would happen with it. It's not like we would have an actual game plan for putting this in our cube. It's just like, here's a green utility land that might do something, and that's not enough for us to play. I'll tell you exactly why this doesn't exile though, is because this was clearly designed as a Dark Depths piece, and they just assumed that this would always copy Dark Depths and just sacrifice itself anyway, so you'd never use it a second time. But yeah, the two cards that came to mind when I saw this as well were Dark Depths and Omniscience. You know, pitch your Omniscience, turn this into an Omniscience later in the game, and then just win from there. So this does some pretty cool things in cubes that aren't ours. And again, low opportunity cost. Like, it's just a tapped green source, and a lot of times it'll just come in untapped anyway. So take from that what you will. But that does close out green and moves us into the home stretch here with the gold cards. Chris, do you want to take our Titan here? Probably one of the, well, not the strongest gold card in the section, but certainly the second runner-up to strongest gold card in the section.
Okay, so this is Flage, Titan of Fire's Fury. 1, a red and a white for a 6/6 Elder Giant, like our friends Kroxa and Uro. When it comes in, you sacrifice it unless it escapes. When it ETBs, it lightning helixes, it does 3 damage to any target, you gain 3 life, and then it has escape for red, red, white, white, exile 5 other cards from your graveyard. So it's basically a perfect analog to the other two in every meaningful way, except it is lightning helix as opposed to explore or discard. This is a really cool card. There's probably not another Boros card that does anything even vaguely like this. Not doing very Borosy things, but this can go in like any mid-range deck. This actually, if your mana is good, this is like a fine finisher to put in your like Jeskai control deck. There is one thing that really angers me about this card though. This is the 3rd Escape Titan that we've gotten, and we still don't have a Golgari one, which is the color pair where this type of effect makes the most fucking sense. So I don't want to see another one of these unless it's green-black, and that's it.
What spell are they going to stable to, like, grapple with the past?
I don't know. I mean, I think everybody knows that Uro should have been a green-black card. Like, that's my 2 cents.
Why don't you throw out a rough design of a green-black one so that
Uro.
when it eventually pops up 6 months from now...
Uro.
A new one, man. A new one.
Just errata.
You can't just copy Uro's homework. This isn't alchemy.
Just re-release Uro, but change the blue symbols to black symbols. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Take the life gain off of there. They don't need that.
No.
I meant to mention this with the red land, but the red land we talked about that gives haste, you can use that to pay for escape costs as well and give these creatures haste and have them come out swinging because escape does cast from the graveyard.
Oh, wow, that's cool.
There's a lot of minor synergies with this card on top of just being kind of like a big Titan. I haven't heard a lot of player talk about this. I think everyone just kind of accepts that it's really strong, and that's it. Like, is there anybody pushing back against this just being an incredible card? Because it reads as like a fantastic red-white card to me.
I mean, I think the only real pushback I have on it is it's a little weird for like so many of the good Boros cards in our section to just not be cards you're going to play. You're not going to be like excited to play in your traditional Boros aggro deck, right? Like we said, you'll play this in your Boros aggro deck as a finisher, but like there are other cards that you don't have to set up that would still, you know, be very, very good in your Boros deck that you probably prioritize. It's kind of the same with Quintorius. Quintorius is like in the Boros section, but not actually a card that's for the Boros decks necessarily. I mean, this card's like good, but I do think all the Titans are ever so slightly overrated in Cube. I feel like I see them unearthed much less often than one might suspect. And that could just be because if you do unearth them, they are so powerful.
I think Uro for sure. Uro is definitely like one of the most overrated cards in terms of like people first picking it, you know, when right. I really don't think you should be first picking Uro that often, but that's very much a translation of like, this card was busted in Standard for 2 years, so it must be busted everywhere, and that's just not true.
Yeah, like in our cube, I actually think Kroxa is better.
Yeah, Kroxa is excellent. I think Kroxa might be a little underrated, but yeah, this seems like a good roster to the Titans, or yeah, I guess they're called Titans, and I'm sure Chris will get his green-black one eventually. I believe when they like designed the Titans and the lore around the Titans, I believe they said there were 4 of them, so maybe we have a 4th one in the future. But
Teld, do you want to talk about White? I know that you were excited about this one.
Yeah, so White of the Reliquary is a riff off Knight of the Reliquary. This one is black-green, so we're shaving a mana off, And we're getting a 2/2 that has vigilance and gets +1/+1 for each creature card in your graveyard. You can tap it and sacrifice another creature to search your library for any land card and put it into play tapped and then shuffle. So this just reads to me like a rock solid Golgari card. It's an interesting design in that Golgari isn't often doing sacrifice oriented things in our cube, and this is kind of a reason to be in that space. But I just like this card. Like, you know, you play it, and then if like you untap with it, you get to start converting your dorky creatures into more mana, which increases the likelihood that you draw gas down the road, gives you more gives this creature more power, like lets you go fetch up any utility land you have. So if you've got any of the I don't remember. I think we're off of all of the Modern Horizons sack lands at the moment, but if you have any of those, if you have any creature lands or things like that, you can go tutor up those. Obviously, if you're in more powerful environments, you can go get stuff like Field of the Dead or Dark Depths or whatever, you know, Thespian Stage. So yeah, I think this card has applications at a number of different power levels for different reasons, which is kind of cool. I think in our environment, it's more just like going to be an undercosted beater that allows you to trade early game creatures in for acceleration, which is probably pretty good. I think this card reads like it'll play really well.
So like when I first read this card, I was like, I'm not really sure. And then you kind of sold me on it. I was like, oh, this has some cool synergies. But the more I've thought about it, I think that this card is actually just pretty solid even without synergies. And what I mean by that is, like, if you have one creature in your graveyard, it's a 3/3 Vig for 2, which is just fine, right? Getting one more creature into your yard, it's a 4/4 Vig for 2, which is an actively great deal. It has Vig, obviously, so you can threaten to sack a creature mid-combat to grow this. And the other thing that I like about it, just like any other sacrifice outlet that provides value, if your opponent goes to, like, remove your green 4-drop creature because they're going to die to it, you just sack it to white, go get a land, and grow the white. Like, you don't have to be abusing the white for this to just be able to get value against anything that's going to chump block or eat a removal spell. I mean, this feels like a 2-drop that your opponent's probably going to, over the course of a game, probably going to have to spend a removal spell on, and that's where I like 2-drops to be. Like, this feels like something that over the course of a game they're going to have to take care of. And then occasionally in a later game, you're just going to top deck it, and instead of it being like a 2-drop dork, it's going to be a 5/5 Vig.
Yeah, I mean, this is actually, I hadn't really thought about it up until this moment, but it could be kind of concerning just given the combination of vigilance plus giant stats that this card will have relatively early into the game in some cases. Like, this could be the kind of card that red decks just can't overcome, right? Like, you play this on like turn 3, turn 4, and it's like a 5/5 or something, and there's like 2 red cards in the entire cube that can deal with it. You play it a little later into the game, and it's just 2 mana, like, brick walls your opponent forever, and also attacks into them.
I'm okay with that on a Golgari card personally, and I don't know how often this is ever going to come up if people are actually going to put these 2 cards in the same deck. But this goes absolutely fucking ham with Bloodghast. You just sack your Bloodghast and it just puts itself back on the battlefield.
It's also pretty good with the Malevolent. We did it, guys. It's good with the Malevolent Rumblings card that we talked about a little while ago, because it could pump up the power by quite a bit. Also gives you a dork to sack to go get a land, so you can convert that Lotus Petal into an actual land, which is quite nice. Yeah. So yeah, like I like this one. I think it's a cool space that is not often used in our cube. I think most of the time the Mardu spectrum is where our sack decks are occurring, and it would be kind of cool if they tried it in like the Abzan or a Junj space. So.
I passed over it initially because of the activated ability, and I had never really considered that this is sometimes just a gigantic 2-drop, so I'm kind of on board with it as well. Do you guys mind if I rant about the next one for just like a moment?
Go ahead.
My personal vote for best new card in the set, most broken card in the set possibly, is Nadu Winged Wisdom. 1 green, blue for a 3/4 flyer. It's a legendary bird wizard at rare. Creatures you control have, quote, whenever this creature becomes the target of a spell or ability, reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land card, put it onto the battlefield. Otherwise, put it into your hand. This ability triggers only twice each turn, which, first off, dumb. Second off, every time you read this card, it gets better. In fact, I just read it for maybe the 8th time, And it just got better for me because I didn't realize the lands it puts into play come in untapped. So it just does that as well. This card is absolutely ridiculous and is like everything I didn't like about Modern Horizons 2, where there's just no restraint on the design of the card. Like, I am increasingly not a fan of cards that are huge value engines and huge stats for very little mana. Like, pick one or the other, don't be both. But 3/4 flyer for 3 is strong. That's just a strong stat line. And then you have an ability that draws you a ton of extra cards, and if it's not straight up drawing you cards, it's just ramping you lands out of your library. It triggers on anything, spell or ability that targets one of your creatures from either player. So if your opponent tries to target one of your creatures, draw a card. If you target one of your own creatures, regardless of what you're targeting it with, draw a card, sometimes rampant, remember. The triggers twice each turn thing is applied to every creature you control individually, instead of that being like an ability on Nadu itself, even though Nadu does have that ability. So you can draw up to 2 cards per creature you control per turn if you have like consistent ways to target things. It triggers off of abilities, so equipment, just simply attaching an equipment to something draws you a card. And all of this is on top of a gigantic beater that your opponent is kind of forced to deal with, and if they target it with something, you draw a card. Not to mention, if you have the protection spell, if you have the Tyvar stand or whatever protection spell they're playing in Vintage Cube, like Legolas's Last Stand, I don't know. If you have that and you trick their trick and you draw 2 cards, I assume the game is just over, because then you have this in play, they're down their removal spell, and you're just up 2 cards in the exchange. That seems ridiculous. And that happens regardless of which creature your opponent tries to remove. If they're forced to like bolt one of your other creatures, you just draw a card. Everything cantrips. This card seems absolutely ridiculous. I hate the design of it. I think the like twice each turn thing is like a weird gimmick that I don't understand, and I'm just not a fan of this one. I hate that it has huge stats on top of this like really game warping ability while being just a perfectly fine card. Like, if they just remove it, you pay 3 mana for your 3/4, they kill it, you draw a card. That seems like a perfectly fine exchange, and that's the floor of the card. Like, that's the absolute floor. The ceiling is I'm drawing 3 cards per turn on top of a creature that's actively killing you while I'm doing that. It seems ridiculous.
Yeah, so from a modern perspective, I understand why I had to have 4 toughness on a 3-drop. I get that. It's in a color pair that is a little underplayed, so I'm like a little more accepting of having an above average stat line than I would normally be, because Simic is fairly unpopular. But you're right that the amount of just knobs that they turn to 11 for the purposes of limited environments, I'm just going to say we do plan to test this card. I expect it to last about as long as Stoic Sphinx, which is to say not long, but it does specifically push kind of into an archetype that we've been trying to work on a little bit. I will say the first time that you play this on turn 3, your opponent targets it with a removal spell. You flip a forest into play and then Tyvar stand it off of like out of nowhere. That is probably the second that you're going to hear someone scream in the chat, and it's going to be completely justified. It just screams really, really powerful, really broken. There's an argument to like, should we even be playing this card or trying this card? Because like we know what it's probably going to happen to it. So it is. I wish they would have shown some restraint somewhere, like make it once per turn, or like other creatures you control have this text, or make it a 2/4 at least. Like, could it have been like a little smaller?
Yeah, like if this is just had a different stat line, I wouldn't be complaining so much. But it's also just going to kill your opponent while presenting this like damned if you do, damned if you don't situation. Not to mention, like, you could easily be like Bant with Ephemerate or something like that, and then your Ephemerate's like cantripping and stuff like that. And it's just like, okay, sure, whatever. We mentioned in a conversation recently Bone Splinter as like just the absolute base broken thing you can do with this. Every time you pay the equip cost to target something with Bone Splinter, you just draw a card. And even if Nadu's your only creature in play and it's already equipped with the Bone Splinter, you can just pay a mana, target it with the Bone Splinter that's already on it to draw a card twice per turn. And once you port over to actual modern or commander or whatever, and you have things like Lightning Greaves, Shuko, these 0 mana equipment, you just basically are drawing 2 cards for every creature you control every turn, which is just not healthy. That's not healthy gameplay pattern. It's not an okay card.
So as Teld mentioned, he and I like kind of screw around drafted one night. And we drafted this weird, like, we've joked around a lot that like Simic Flash is not like ever going to function, but like it kind of is. Like it is and it isn't. It's not like a Simic Flash deck. It does happen to play like Flash creatures and counter spells, and tricks and protection stuff like Tyvar Stand and Slip Out the Back, but it also includes like really high value cards like this. And this is like, I actually love this design because it plays so well into this kind of like Simic deck that not only have we been theory crafting, but like is actually in tests been working really well. Okay, I understand that it has 4 toughness because it's a 3-drop and Modern needs to survive bolts or whatever, but like I feel like that is partially mitigated by the fact that if they do bolt it, you just get refunded the card anyway. I don't understand why it applies this text to your other creatures. Not that that even really matters, because if they're going to burn removal to try to kill this thing, like, they're going to attack this first. So, like, I mean, whatever. That text is there. Power on it is too high. It's a shame. It's a shame, because I do think that this will get banned out of our environment for just being just dummy thick.
This could have been a cool card, I think. A card that I liked quite a bit, but they pushed it to... It triggers on ability, so you can, like... have your Bristly Bill or whatever trigger, put a counter on this, and draw a card. Like, oh, God forbid Bristly Bill like hits a land, and then you put that on the battlefield and just trigger Bristly Bill again.
Oh my God!
Put a counter on this again.
Yeah,
it hits another land. Oops, I'll target Bristly Bill this time.
This is one of those cards where the more times I read it, the more it just like does everything. So like I said, I don't expect this card to survive because I'm sure it will be insanely frustrating. And to think that this is going to be like a Simic card is a little silly, right? Because this is just the kind of card that if you'll stretch your mana to put this in your deck, like period. Like I'm pretty sure I would stretch my mana to put this in like an Azorius control deck. But what I do like about the design, even if it doesn't survive for just being entirely too pushed on too many dimensions, is I'm hoping that this is signaling a foray in the future into this kind of space more in Simic. Perfect card specifically for something we've been tinkering with and are interested in. Just way too good.
Yeah, it's Harvey Birdman looking motherfucker. Teld, talk to me about this next. Actually, you got 2 here you added, and I have some thoughts on the second one you added. But talk to us about Psycho Frog here.
Yeah. So first of all, Psychic Frog is a S tier reference. That is, I love it. So the card it's just referencing is Psychotog, which is an old control staple, like amazing old card. Anyways. This card's really, really good. So it is blue and a black for a 1/2, and whenever it deals combat damage to a player or planeswalker, you draw a card, and then you can discard a card to put a +1 counter on Psychic Frog, and you can exile 3 cards from your graveyard to give it flying until end of turn. So this card seems like a card that is going to end up being like constructed all-star type card. I feel like this is the kind of card that'll probably see play in like Legacy, and maybe I'm overestimating it because you do have to deal combat damage. But if you're on the play, it's really good. It can pump up to trade with creatures if you need to. It starts flying once you've added cards to your graveyard, which you're doing while you're making this thing grow with discard. Plays in blue, so you get protection spells and black to get discard spells to ensure it's going to get through. You can pair it with the black removal to clear out creatures in the early game. Yeah, I mean, this is an effect that usually we see weaker versions of this effect at 3, and we are getting the best version of this effect at 2. This isn't Ragavan, but like this is a pretty obnoxious on the play 2-drop, I think.
Yeah, I could see it. I know people are talking about it with Murktide Regent specifically. Is that like the kind of shells that people are aiming for? Because it puts cards in the graveyard for Delve, and then it also grows your Murktide Regent once it's on board. It draws you extra cards and stuff like that. So I don't... I guess my question is, where do you see it in the context of Cube? Because I don't quite see it in our Cube, and I'm not sure like if I'm misevaluating or something, but I'm not sure like where it would fit in the context of Vintage Cube either. Like maybe there's like Fallen Shinobi decks or something like that would like this type of card. Like if you have access to like Baleful Strix, isn't Baleful Strix usually going to be like what you want out of this card more consistently, or am I missing something? Like, is this the type of card you think would actually like have legs in say our mainline cube?
I mean, I think we could definitely play it if we wanted. I think the big advantage this has over Baleful Strix is the snowballiness of it. So Baleful Strix is super reliable. Like, obviously, you always draw a card. It always gets its guy or trades for a removal spell. And this won't always do that. The thing is that in these sort of more tempo-oriented shells where you're playing counter magic, you're playing discard, things like that, I think the ceiling on this card is just so much higher than Baleful Strix that I think it's got a home. Like, especially in more tempo-y decks, like I think you really would like to have a card that creates more pressure, that forces your opponent to removal spell it. Because like a lot of times Baleful Strix comes down, draws a card, and then trade, and like your opponent can kind of ignore it until they have a decent trade, like a Bowmasters or something. So I think this card has a lot of edges on a card like Strix, where like, yeah, the injury cost is higher, but the ceiling is also like super high on this card. Maybe I'm overestimating it, but I mean, I think this card has legs, is where I'm gonna stand on this.
What about this counterspell? I know Chris is not a fan of this one. I'm really not either, though. I think it's actually a little more powerful than I originally gave it credit for.
Oh yeah. So the other card I had on here is Invert Polarity. So it is blue, red for an instant. Choose target spell, then flip a coin. If you win, gain control of that spell, and you may choose new targets for it. If you lose the flip, counter spell. So this is not a card that I like the design of. I hate this more than Nadu, actually. I think this is the dumbest card in the entire set. I don't want it anywhere near any cube that I play. So if I see this in your list, I'm going to politely bow out of whatever cube it is. But 50% of the time, this is the best card in the set, which is the really frustrating thing about this card. 50% of the time, it's cancel. Right? It's hard to cast cancel, which is not a card I would ever put in a cube deck by itself. But 50% of the time, this is a 6-mana spell. And you're just going to like randomly lose the game because your opponent held up counterspell mana and then they had this and they win the flip. And it is not going to feel okay. Like if this is a 3-mana spell that counters your opponent's 3-drop and gives you a good 3-drop, like how do you lose from that position?
Someone on Twitter described it as fractured identity on the stack.
Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. Like 50% of the time, this is just fractured identity on the stack.
First off, I hate coin flip cards in general, but even more than the variants of coin flip cards, I hate coin flip cards where there's no negative result to the coin flip. Like, to me, if you're going to make a coin flip card, the appeal of coin flipping in general, if there even is appeal, is that there's like a negative and there's a positive to coin flipping. But when both things are just a positive, it's like, oh, nothing can go wrong. So why are you using the coin flip mechanic in general? The only reason this uses a coin flip is because somebody at Wizards absolutely loves their blue-red coin flip commander deck and keeps designing cards for it. But yeah, I hate this personally. I would never advocate for playing this in cube. And even if we did, the mana cost is like super restrictive. It's blue, red.
Oh, I would stretch my mana 100% of the time to play this, by the way. Like if you put this in a cube, I think this is going to be one of the best cards in your cube. Like 50% of the time, you just win the game for a 3-minute spell. GG.
And I think I'm safe to say that Chris just doesn't care about this card at all. So.
Nope.
I want to real briefly touch on these last two MDFCs here. We mentioned the Waterlogged Grove already. That was the Waterlogged Teach-ins, which is the blue-black Mystical Teach-ins MDFC. There's going to be a big conversation about these for the Peasant Cube in particular, but I'll save that for the bonus episode. Here, I just wanted to mention, too, that probably don't make the cut in the mainline cube, but I think are absolutely worth playing. There's Revitalize and Repast, which is a single Golgari mana, or the green or black, for an instant. It puts a +1/+1 counter on target creature and gains indestructible until end of turn. And then there's Stump Stomp, which is 1 and a Gruul mana, so either green or red. And it's a sorcery that has Rabid Bite text. It deals damage equal to its power to target creature or planeswalker you don't control. And the reason I like these cards and think that they're just like eminently playable if you want to make room for them in your sections is that they're not overcharging on the front half. These are just effects that you could print as the front half, but they give you the flexibility of being MDFCs. Rabid Bite, not good enough for cube. Rabid Bite that's hybrid mana, still not good enough for cube. But Rabid Bite that is just a land when you need it to, yeah, that seems perfectly fine. Same with the protection spell. So Chris, I believe, said he just finds these designs boring. Like they don't seem like fantastic uses of gold slots. I completely get that, but I think these, and maybe there's some other MDFCs that we left off the list here, but I think the ones that are just like good card and then also MDFC, I think those are perfectly fine to run in a cube if you wanted to make space for them. That's really the thing, is the cube equity conversation there. Are they good enough? Absolutely. Are they the best use of like a Gruul or Golgari slot in your cube? They're a little unexciting for that but I think they're certainly good enough if that's the decision you come down on.
Yeah, I think the thing I would say about particularly revitalizing Repass, because it's so cheap, is that this is not a Golgari card. It is a green or black card, so it is two monocolored cards stapled together on top of a land. This one in particular, I'm pushing back pretty hard on not testing. Like, I think this is the kind of card that's just like so efficient that a deck's going to find it and use it. In a lot of cases, this is just going to be like Malakir Rebirth that doesn't cost you life and is also a dual land.
It's good enough. I'm like the in-betweener here where Teld thinks it's great and we should play it, and Chris probably thinks it's like fine but isn't really worth the slot, and it's like, yeah, both of those arguments I think are like valid, and it's just a decision of like, do you make the cut for it or not?
Yeah, I mean, I can see why you wouldn't make a cut for it, but I think in terms of rate, this is a card that's going to make most, if not all, of your green or black decks. Maybe I'm over-exaggerating that a little bit because the land always comes to play tapped, which is a downside. But, you know, the protection spell is so efficient, it's relatively easy in Modern Magic to find spots where you can leave open a single mana if you need to, if you've got something worth protecting.
Well, that's it for the MDFCs there. And that actually brings us to a close. Like I said, there's so many powerful things in this set that we could talk about for various reasons. There's the Eldrazi, there's the Flares, there's things like the pitch elementals for our environment, which we would never play, but it is something on Arena. But especially when it comes to the reprints, they're kind of known factors. Nobody needs us to tell them that like Grief and Fury are powerful cards. So we left them off. And I'm sure, as we usually do, like a month from now, we'll see a couple cards that are like, well, we didn't talk about that on the review episode. Maybe this is actually good enough. Usually takes a couple reps with the limited format to figure out some of these cards we talked about aren't that good, and some of the ones we didn't talk about definitely warrant some conversation. So even with us going through, 27 pages of show notes here, feels like we could have talked about a lot. We left a lot on the table, but just some quick overall impressions from my perspective. This just feels like a Modern Horizon set to me. It feels like they came into this saying, oh, we're gonna introduce the next evolution of certain things here. We saw the next evolution of a Blood Artist. We saw a free sack outlet, which feels like maybe the most powerful 3-mana sack outlet we've ever had. The red removal got a bump up. We're seeing probably the best 2-mana dork we've ever seen, or at least in the conversation with the Ronis brothers, or whatever the snake guy's called. So it feels like they came in with a goal of making cards that would push the envelope. And I think they did that successfully, very much at the common and uncommon level here. The rares don't feel Ragavanish to me, aside from things like Nadu and maybe even the Titan. Maybe the Red-White Titan falls into that category. I'll have to see that one in play. But I feel like they're pushing the envelope on what they can do at lower rarities with traditional effects. And I think part of that is, they know this is a Modern Horizon set, and they know that there's expectations behind that name now. And B, play boosters, right? They have to shape a limited environment where there's supposedly like no unplayable cards or whatever. But there's a lot here that's going to bolster our mainline cube. The Peasant Cube is going to be an entire separate conversation. And then all of those little gimmick cubes and novel cubes that we have floating around. There's tons of stuff here. So I'm excited about what we're getting. I don't feel like we landed on that many cards that were just like, oh, this is so stupid, we could never play that. So I feel like it's maybe a little more restrained than the previous Modern Horizon sets, which is a good thing, but that might also be a product of we're just not talking about all of the most busted things that are actually here. So that's just my 2 cents. I'm not sure if you guys have any burning thoughts on Modern Horizons 3 here before we wrap up.
Yeah, I think they did a much better job this time of having cards not just be like grossly overpowered and obvious, where like Solitude or Ragavan are just such egregious power outliers in terms of what they do. I think a lot of the really powerful cards in this environment do ask you to build around them just a little bit, to give them a little bit of support, you know, to do some things to get there. I mean, there's obviously some really, really cracked cards like Nadu, and there's some that I have my eye on as like concerning. But I like the designs of a lot of these cards, even in the ones where I think they went a little crazy, keeping in mind that a lot of these rares are designed to break into a format that is extremely powerful. So yeah, overall, I mean, I think the designs are cool. The reprints were cool. Even though I hate them, I am glad that we have access to the pitch elementals on the client. That's going to be nice for cubes that are doing really, really broken stuff like the Timeless Cube as it slowly turns into like Vintage Light. So yeah, I think there's a lot of cool stuff going on, good stuff going on. I'm more excited, to be honest, to talk about the peasant episode, because even though there's like 70 peasant cards to changes going on in the cube, I think a lot of the designs that they really pushed there are sweet, and again, like a lot of them ask you to provide them with a little bit of synergy to really get there.
Yeah,
So.
I do not envy you guys the task of having to do basically another one of these, but maybe longer for peasant.
Yeah.
I don't envy us either. The one nice thing is peasant cards, even in this set, do tend to be a little more straightforward. There's a lot less angle shooting in peasant. There's much more. The card just does what it says it does.
Yeah, that's going to be a task for sure, and I'm not looking forward to editing 2 back-to-back, three and a half hour long recordings or whatever. But I'll suck it up. I'll suck it up for you, the listener. Chris, what are your thoughts on Modern Horizons 3? You excited?
You heard it here, folks. Tim will suck you up. No,
that's not the wordage I used. Why would you do that?
You know why I would do that. Yeah, it's a Modern Horizons set. A lot of cool stuff. I do wish, with the current state of our own cube meta, that Red had gotten a little luckier. But that's okay. Still some decent stuff. I do like that they spent a decent amount of real estate on heavily thematic stuff, which in standard sets I don't really like, because that mitigates the number of like potentially interesting designs for us. But in a set like this one, where the generically good cards are just all going to be worth talking about, having them expound on some themes was actually welcome.
Yeah. Before we close out, do you guys have a favorite card from the set that you're looking forward to playing, or something that you just have a big question mark over right now?
I am excited to play with the Nightmare card, just because it's such a unique effect in black, and I'm going to try to get my reps in while I can, because I assume we're going to have to cut it.
Yeah, I mean, I also think the Nightmare card is super sweet, even if I expect to have to cut it. Kind of the same with Nadu, like this.
You spikes. You guys are such spikes. Get out of here.
I've been really enjoying messing around with the theory crafting on this like blue-green deck. So like, even though I know Nadu's cracked, I like that one. But from a non-spike or a less spiky sentiment, I do think some of these white aggro cards look pretty good. The White Orchid Phantom and like the Guide of Souls in particular look like cards that will I do occasionally like to just turn my brain off and turn some creatures sideways, and these look good for that sort of deck. So
yeah, the white 1-drops are cool. Like, I think that they're strong, and they play on a very different axis than any of the white 1-drops that we already have, so that's cool. And I am looking forward to the first groan that I elicit, flashing in Hope Ender Coatl and countering your 4-drop.
That's the one that's going to get me. I don't tilt very often in Magic, but that's a tilter card for sure. I'm looking forward to the Red Land. I think the Red Land is really sweet design, the one that gives haste to creatures. And honestly, a big question mark for me right now is Tamiyo. I don't know how Tamiyo is going to play out. As far as exciting, Kappa Cannoneer, I'm ready to ruin the Affinity Cube. So we're going to go and just throw that one in there and let people complain about it. But yeah, there's actually a lot of exciting stuff. Could go into detail, but I feel like we did a pretty good job of that during the review here. With all that being said, thanks as always to everyone listening. Remember, the best way to support Jank Diver Gaming and the Jank Tank podcast is to join our Discord server. Come draft with us, give us your feedback. It's a great place to hang out with like-minded individuals and talk about Cube, Retail Limited, all things Magic. Think of it like your online LGS. You can find links to our Discord server wherever you're listening to this podcast right now. We have scheduled drafts 4 days a week. We draft our mainline cube on Sunday and Wednesday nights, our peasant cube on Saturday nights. We have an FNM style draft from Player Vote Cube on Friday nights, and we have various Jank Diver cubes and user submitted guest cubes on Saturday and Sunday mornings. You can check out our socials on Twitter at JankDiverGaming, YouTube.com/JankDiverGaming, and you can find Teld streaming on Twitch.tv/TeldTalks, TELD Talks. Thanks to all the listeners for hanging in there. This was a long one, and we've got one that's probably just as long coming up. We'll have a bonus episode for the Peasant Cube with, I think, just myself and Teld, where we're gonna be doing something pretty drastic with our lands, I think. And in addition to talking about every other common and uncommon.
See, this situation is where I reveal my true genius, because you guys think that I recused myself from working on the Peasant Cube because I was no longer interested in it, but in fact, I was anticipating this episode and did not want to do it.
Oh, you slimy bastard.
Really playing the long game there, Chris.
Who's really the FBI agent?
We've talked about this for a couple of episodes, or for the last couple of set reviews, we've discussed possibly having a peasant review. Me and Tim, I don't remember if we mentioned it on air, but we have talked about it off air. And it felt like if we were ever going to actually do that and pull the trigger, this is the set to do so, because this is just the most relevant set for peasant probably ever. It's a very, very, very deep set in terms of what's going on. And yeah, I'm excited to make a lot of people mad with what we're doing to the mana. So
I'm excited to talk about it too, but I am not promising everybody peasant reviews from now until the end of time. I'm not making that promise right now, so we'll see how the editing process goes for this one, because I'm in the middle of Hell Week as well for doing all the editing for the articles that are coming through for Modern Horizons. But to the listener, thanks as always for listening to the Jank Tank. My name's Timothy Zaccanino with Christopher Sofsky and Teld. We will catch you all next time. And now 40 seconds of Teld talking about magic like a deranged madman.
Zombie Goblin Wizard. This card is very dumb, and then the multiverse breaks down. We did it, guys! I expect this card to be very, very silly. Yes, our Grixis Flame of Anor sack deck. And now you know that you're cooked instead of just guessing that you're cooked. And it is not going to feel okay. This card is going to be really, really stupid. But you actually, in addition to getting your hat, not a vehicle, confirmed, little lore dump, you can't just copy Uro's homework. Yeah, this card seems cracked. Low-key thick 2-drop. I do occasionally like to just turn my brain off. You played this on turn 3, you win the game. That is some chef's kiss damage pushing. I don't know, this card is silly. Drawn 8 cards and all of them were lands because they nugged you for 5, doming you for damage. And
sometimes Teld says literally insane things, and we have to protect, we have to protect other people's brains from his mind virus.
GG.